Okay, we'll get started. Oh, with my raspy voice, y'all. So sorry. Hello, everyone. I am Heather Reams, and I am president of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, and I'm also chair of National Clean Energy Week. This is the 7th annual National Clean Energy Week. We're very excited you're able to join us, both in person and online. COVID got us a little behind, so we did everything online, and now we're back in person for our third day of programming at the Policymakers Symposium. So we are thrilled that you're with us today. A little bit of housekeeping. There is a National Clean Energy Week app that you can download to track whether you're here in the audience or you're watching from your desk at home or at work. You also can ask questions through the app as well and get the latest on what's going on, bios and other pieces. There also is a QR code that you can search to get, we have around the room where you can scan that as well. Also want to thank our sponsors. We couldn't do this without our sponsors, and in fact, this symposium is free of cost to everybody because we want everyone to learn about this, and that is because of the generosity of our sponsors. They are the heart and soul of making us available to everybody. We're very, very grateful. You'll also see on chairs a lot of information, but one of them also is a newspaper, and we did a compilation in the Washington Times, has a lot of op-eds and pieces about clean energy from different policymakers on both sides of the aisle to show that this is not a red or blue issue, it's really a red, white, and blue issue. Okay, so we have an amazing group of speakers this week, including the first panel. So I'd love to invite Deputy Secretary, Xochitl Torres-Small and Mark Menezes up to the stage, please. They're on? Hi. Nice to see you. I'll take off my readers. I think I'm good. I'll do a little introductions first here, then we'll get rolling on questions. Xochitl, you are now the Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of Agriculture. But before that, you were a member of Congress from New Mexico, which was actually the 5th largest district in the state. Is that by size? By size.
Basically.
Incredible. So you get the West, yes. You were a member of the House Agriculture Committee, the Armed Services Committee, and the Oversight, Management, and Accountability Subcommittee on the House Homeland Security Committee. So we're thrilled you're here today, talking from the Department of Agriculture's perspective. Thank you for being here. And Mark Menezes, you're now President and Chief Executive Officer of the United States Energy Association. That represents 150 members across the United States. In the energy sector, some of the largest companies probably you have in your membership. Many of probably are sponsors today, so thank you. You're also the former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Energy for the Trump administration. And prior to that, you served as the Undersecretary of Energy. So we've got energy background. And then we're missing our esteemed your colleague, Deputy Secretary David Turk, who has COVID. Of all things. So he is not here today. So Mark is going to stream some Secretary Turk and his own experiences. And then it's interesting that we've got agriculture and energy here. And we're going to talk about how this works together. So first of all, I guess kind of opening questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about your day-to-day work, what you do at the department, and also maybe why you're here at Clean Energy Week.
Thanks so much. And now it's on. That's great. Thanks so much. Sometimes folks look at me walking in the room representing USDA and they're thinking, what is she doing here? What does USDA have to do with energy? And a lot, actually. Before doing this, I served as Undersecretary for Rural Development, which is in the Department of Ag. And the roots of rural development are in the Rural Electrification Act. So in the 1930s, when folks decided that no matter where you live, you should be able to turn on the light at night. That enormous investment in rural equity is part of the origin of the Department of Agriculture. And it makes sense because so much of the energy that is produced happens in rural places. So much of the energy as it is transmitted across very rural places. And the folks who are living in rural places are often paying much more in terms of share of income than urban people. In fact, about a third more of their income is being paid for electricity costs. So there are real challenges when it comes to living in rural places. And so USDA has been investing in that for a long time. And thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, USDA is doubling down on that investment with historic investments in this work. And it makes a difference. As you mentioned, I come from New Mexico.
Yeah.
And in New Mexico, we have real experience in energy. We have the Permian Basin. We have some of the largest wind and solar operations. And we have folks who have been able to send their kids to college because of their work in oil and gas specifically. And so I know that impact, that history, that opportunity that individuals have forged out because of energy work. I also know the boom and bust cycles that have occurred as a result of that, the impact that can have on families, the impact that can have on communities. And so what I've seen is those very same communities, those very same workers starting to identify themselves as energy workers, starting to recognize that there is opportunity in investing across the spectrum and in being part of a solution that includes a solution to reliable energy, to resilient energy, and also to fight climate change. So these are the opportunities that we have when it comes to these historic investments, and why USDA, recognizing that rural electric cooperatives, which we'll talk more about soon, I hope, rural electric cooperatives are such a fundamental part of the solution when they provide energy for 56% of the nation's land mass.
Oh, great. Now, Mark, you're no stranger to National Clean Energy Week. You have spoken as when you were Deputy Secretary a few years ago, when we were in person, so pre-COVID. Now that you're on the other side, you're not in the administration anymore, what are some changes that you see going on in energy, probably reflecting on your role you have now, but then also differentiating once upon a time, I'd say 4 years ago, to where we are now?
Well, thank you, and it is an honor and a privilege to be on this panel and to be here, and it's good to see some of my old friends in the audience. In the Department of Energy, the thing that you have there is you have the dedication of professionals that will look for innovative new technologies to help meet, the energy transition, and you have to figure out a way to deploy it. So when you get to the energy, you get to the Energy Department. It's really you're amazed at all of the work that is going on to really push breakthrough technologies, because if we're going to meet the net zero goals, you need new technologies, you need new materials, and you need new ways to model things. So it's a dynamic department. And my observations since being out, of course, I've joined the United States Energy Association, which actually has relationships with several agencies, including the department, but also USAID and the State Department. And so we are aligned with the efforts to address the growing populations in the developing countries, and yet bring energy to the growing populations there. And if we can, to deploy the latest technologies so that they don't have to repeat some of the trials and errors, that we had the luxury of doing here. And so it's all about to help these countries meet net zero goals. And so we're very much aligned. What you see with this department is they're committed to address the climate crisis now. And they are working with a sense of urgency. They have when you hear the Secretary Granholm speak, she speaks with a language that we really don't have time to waste. And there's a real sense of urgency throughout the department. They really have a culture to really try to get things done, not just to do research, but to actually push and deploy new technologies out of the door. They also, they're twice the size now of when I was over there. With the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, they really have doubled the size. And they have been on a hiring spree. They have restructured to reflect the priorities of Congress. They've created an entire office of infrastructure, again, to go along with deploying the technology. And an important priority that they have is to facilitate an equitable energy transition. That's a very important priority of theirs, of our Energy Department today. And indeed, when you look at all the grants that they are pushing out and loans, the Loan Program Office is actually functioning now, notwithstanding our best efforts to try to get it to issue a few loans. You can see that that's their priority, really, to act with alacrity. So those are some of my observations, and how it's a bit different, from when I was there. We innovated in the world of cybersecurity and emergency response and artificial intelligence. Those were, some of the big issues that we tried to address then.
We'll hear from Director Shah later today at the Loan Program Office. I call him his rock star status. He's doing so much over there, but really transformational. So we will unpack that later today. How about the Department of Agriculture, the part about climate? Are you seeing more of a laser focus? And then let me give you the other side of that. Is that all you're thinking about? It's the Biden administration. All you think about is climate. So push back on that.
Oh, that's such an important question, because when it comes to agriculture, first and foremost, we're usually thinking about feeding America, right? We're thinking about how we're creating more and better markets for farmers. And what that looks like is a whole bunch of different ways that farmers can diversify their income. And so that can be climate smart commodities. It can also be local regional markets. It can also be expanding trade opportunities. So we're looking at all sorts of things. Now, when it comes to energy investments for USDA, we have a similar approach. What are the ways that these investments are going to serve the people all across the country, and particularly when it comes to rural America, where so many of our farmers are, and where so many of the people who are producing not just the food, but also the fiber and the fuel for our nation are living? So that means when we invest even climate funds, we're looking at doing it in ways that support rural people, that invest in jobs. So the investments from the Inflation Reduction Act that come to USDA, there's been an outside perspective that looks at the things we're going to create about 90,000 jobs out of that. It also looking at investing over $90 billion in rural communities. So what does that look like for local town revenue? What does that look like for cities' revenue? What does that look like for a state to be able to have that income to create? And then also for the local small businesses on Main Street that then have more disposable income because folks because those jobs are created. So that's part of the approach. The other part of the approach is making sure we're focusing the opportunity in the parts of rural America that need it most. We've all experienced what it's like when a town gets hollowed out. If it's a place you used to go because your grandparents lived there, or your parents, or if it's a place you would vacation, when stores get boarded up around Main Street, the impact that has. And so the opportunity to start building, to bring manufacturing opportunities all across rural America, because the energy is now there, will have a lasting impact. And then lastly, it is also about climate. And part of the reason that that's true is because I talk to farmers every single day who are having to change the way they do their work because the climate has changed. They're more worried about drought. They're more worried about disaster. And they know that they have even less certainty than they used to in the past. And so they want to be on the front lines of addressing that challenge too.
You also mentioned, Mark, you mentioned other countries kind of hopscotching and getting forward to a place where they're going to have better technologies. And I'm thinking about rural America and how the challenge is there. Do you see a similarity between developing nations and in rural America? Albeit we're in a blessed country, so I don't mean to compare them exactly, but do you see similarities there?
Yeah, I think your point's a good one. In fact, the Deputy Secretary and I were talking before coming out here and was asking about the relationships that the Department of Energy had when I was over there. And we had entered into an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, there to facilitate what we have been talking about here today. So you have unique needs in rural America for certain types of energy, certain to be deployed, and in communities that frankly need development to help grow the community, but provide the energy. It's got to be affordable, got to be reliable, it's got to be clean, got to be resilient today. So, and they have no choice. And the interesting thing about rural communities, we get all excited when we came up with, the ideas of a circular economy, right? Well, what do you think rural America has been doing, right? I mean, they are economists in all aspects of everything they do, including, energy. So, we learned a lot of lessons from them, and yet we can deploy these new technologies out there to help, much like what we do in developed countries. But look, we've got this new technology. You have a need. We may have the opportunity to come in and not only deploy the technology, it's important, but also have right regulatory policies in place. Don't make the same mistakes that we might have had. Try to create opportunities. What we learn at USEA, and I'm sure it's all politics is local, you learn that you can bring the best plans, you can bring the best technologies, you can bring the shiny new object to places that will receive it with open arms. But unless the community sees it as a need, the opportunities will not last.
Yeah, that
okay,
makes sense.
And whatever you do, you have to have capacity building in place, and you can't force anything on anybody. And so we find that it's organically driven, and I think that's what you see in rural America too. Don't come over here and try to force something on us
Right.
just to meet some national goal. Let it grow organically.
Can I jump in
Yeah,
on
yeah,
that?
please.
Because it's such a good point. It has to be driven. Early on, I studied international development, and the main thing I learned was that in international development, things only stick when they're driven locally, when you've got a local expert who knows their home and is invested in it. And that's what rural development requires too. You've got to know someone who knows the land, who has the experience, who's excited about these investments and owning those projects. So it's been really exciting to see with our flagship program, so with the New Era funds, which is the $9.7 billion available to rural electric cooperatives. These are local organizations, often members of the board or farmers and beyond. That program had double the number of applications than we had money for.
Wow.
And those are locally driven investments. The PACE program, so that's for anyone if they're producing and providing energy in rural America. It's about a $1 billion program. 7 times the amount, $7.4 billion in applications for those $1 billion. So you're absolutely right. There's got to be local buy-in, and folks are really buying into these opportunities.
Fantastic. You mentioned the cooperatives. I didn't want to make sure I circled back around that. How does that fit into all of this?
It's an interesting intersection, right? They were created. They were created as part of the Rural Electrification Act, as part of the New Deal, to make sure that there's local control over electric systems, and as part of the solution to energizing America in the first place. Now they're a great opportunity to also diversify opportunities and build a more resilient grid. So there are a lot of rural electric co-ops. There's actually 800 co-ops who deliver electricity, and then 60 of them across the country are generators of electricity, and they cover about 56% of the world's or of the country's land mass. So they are some of the hidden giants that folks don't always think about. But if we really are going to make sure that our energy is affordable, that it is resilient, and that it is cleaner, this gives us the chance to do that.
You probably know that the USEA actually relies on the NRECA, the rural co-ops, to actually accompany us and provide experts when we do go to the developing countries and other areas in Eastern Europe, et cetera, to help inform the locals there.
That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
That actually is great.
Yeah. We also team up with NARUC, the regulators, to make sure that there's some regulatory bodies somewhere, but the NRECA is a really great partner with USEA.
So it's National Clean Energy Week. I want to kind of focus in on clean energy itself and how it is changing the landscape. You said farmers or the innovators, right? They know what's going on. Can you speak to how farmers are embracing clean energy, or they're sequestering carbon? Can you speak to how some of the things that you're seeing in your work at the Department of Agriculture?
It's a fun question because there's so many different models, the way farmers can do this. I was in Michigan recently, and I was talking with a farmer who had done everything she could because she wanted to help fight climate change. So she, of course, had solar on her barn, but she also just had a more efficient tractor, because she knew that that was part of the investment. She'd worked with NRCS in terms of some of her sequestration opportunities and also preserving the land there. She also, of course, as most rural people are, they have 6 different jobs depending on what time of day it is, was a member of her soil and water conservation district and was working and was part of the application for a climate smart commodities partnership. Now, there's a new opportunity here with the new Inflation Reduction Act money. So the Rural Energy for America program received a dramatic increase in funds. It's also seen a dramatic jump in applications as a result. And that's for a farmer who might want a more efficient grain dryer, all the way to a farmer who wants to create new energy through a methane digester, or, of course, solar or wind. It's also got a set aside, so farmers who are really innovative and say, you know what, there's this new way to be more energy efficient or to produce renewable energy. I'm going to try a technology that's not quite as common, and so they have an easier application as a result of that. So there's this opportunity now for farmers, if they, to work with, to get grants through REAP, through the Rural Energy for America program. There's also potentially an opportunity with the rural electric cooperatives. If farmers want to come together and maybe lease some of their land to be able to diversify their revenue stream, they can, get $18,000 extra a year for allowing wind production on their land, or it's usually about $5,500 extra a year for leasing some of their land for solar, and then add that to their revenue stream so it can allow them to continue to produce in the future.
So they're growing energy sometimes too.
That's an opportunity that they can choose.
That's fantastic. Mark, looking back at the where you were, the Department of Energy, you mentioned twice the size or however it's growing. What do you see as the direction of Department of Energy with so much investment? What should we look forward to?
Oh, well, thank you for that question. And I know if Deputy Secretary Turk were here, he would want to talk about a couple of these priorities that they have. And they're very excited about it. And in fact, we were also excited about it when we did some similar things. But and it's all on the website, and it's really fantastic what they're doing. I talked about overcoming the deployment of technologies that you have and to innovate. And so they have 2 initiatives that they get very excited about, and everybody in the room should be excited about it. If you're not aware of them, go to the website. So there's Pathways to Commercial Liftoff, and it is what you expect. So it's existing technologies, but done in an integrated way, and it's what you would expect. Let's get advanced nuclear out, carbon management, clean hydrogen, long-duration energy storage. I mean, that's always, to me, breakthrough technology. They've added 2 very interesting areas here. The first is industrial decarbonization. They are very serious about reducing emissions in the industrial processes, whether it's hard to abate or not, but they are really going after that. And then virtual power plants. You really need to spend some time to figure out what a virtual power plant is. It's distributed energy, resources, and it's also demand-side management, some of the things that you've accustomed to. But it's fascinating spending 5 minutes just looking at that. And then to actually create innovation, to stimulate innovation, they have earth shots, similar to moon shots. And the topics, again, as you expect, a carbon negative shot. This is removing CO2 directly from the atmosphere. Okay, so this is direct air capture. It was something we were really excited about back then. The clean fuels, so we know about ethanol, we know about some of the biogenic fuels that the farmers can create and blend to help reduce some of those emissions. Geothermal, offshore wind, the hydrogen shot, long duration storage, which we talked about, and again, that industrial heat shot. Again, we're going after the manufacturing base in a way to help reduce emissions with creative ways. Again, this is all voluntary. Congress was clear. They didn't issue any mandates. They offered tax incentives, and they provided funding for really, in my view, this was historic. It's not generational. It is historic, and by all measures, it is go time to invest and deploy these technologies.
I'm a little bit in awe of all of that. Wow. I mean, just thinking about what's happening. Where do you see, one more question, I'll come to you, Xochitl. What is like the 10 years, 20 years, this investment today, where do you think that takes us?
Well, I think it hopefully takes us to your net zero goals,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, again, our world has really changed. Since COP26, and for the first time, you had a commitment for carbon abatement, and you had net zero goals from all the countries. And this administration has been very, very aggressive about it. And so you'll see a lot of analytics on if they can deploy what Congress has authorized,
Right.
and if taxpayers can take advantage of the tax credits. And remember, there's an interagency process going around right now to help Treasury get the guidance out. There are literally billions of dollars waiting to move, and as tax lawyers, you can't do anything without the guidance. But I will say there's been an interagency process. DOE has been very involved in making technical recommendations to Treasury Department so that when the guidance comes out, it can be deployed, and if it's deployed in the amount that people are expecting, potentially, you can hit some net zero goals, and you can look for, the goals for increase in EV use, and certainly emission reduction goals in the power sector. That's
Big deal.
we've been making so many reductions in the power sector that now it's transportation that really is the number one emitter. So now we're looking at ways to reduce in the transportation sector, and again, in the industrial component part of it.
As we wrap up, same question, 10, 20 years, where are we going with agriculture?
It's absolutely finding ways to get to net zero and finding ways to make sure that farmers and rural people can make a profit out of that. That we are building markets that are competitive, that are investments in rural people, and that support and invest in innovative farmers who are eager to be part of the solution and to have more access to markets as a result.
Fantastic. We're out of time. Thank you so much for participating. If you'll give our participants a round of applause. Thank you.
It's a fascinating. Thank you, Heather, and thank you to the deputy secretaries for their insights today. I think it's a fantastic scene setter for our conversations throughout this afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm Chrissy Harbin. I'm with Cres Forum, and it's my job today to ensure that we stay on time. So with that, I am turning things over to Landon Darrence, who's Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Forum. And he is going to moderate a conversation on reducing emissions in the industrial sector. Over to you, Landon.
Hey, thanks, Chrissy, and welcome to the audience here in Washington, D.C., and certainly to those online viewing this virtually. I'm Landon Darrence, as Chrissy said. I'm the Senior Director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council, and really excited and thankful for Cres and the National Clean Energy Week team for pulling together a strong panel to talk about the role of industrial sector in abating emissions while maintaining American competitiveness. I think it appears that we're at the forefront of an era of clean industrial policy. And in recent years, the United States has really gone out of its way to enact a series of energy, emissions, and infrastructure policies that are widely seen as critical to reaching net zero ambitions. The Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm sure we'll hear about, the bipartisan infrastructure law, CHIPS, other legislation speak to an increasingly cohesive approach to how the United States and private industry can collaborate to move forward with industrial decarbonization. And while progress is being made, I think it's important to note that more work needs to be done. Industrial emissions account for 1/3 approximately of US GHG emissions and requires swift action in this space if we're going to stay on course to meet our targets. How do we navigate and transform our industrial base and maintain at the same time a competitive edge while we access reliable and affordable energy? That's what we're going to dive into. So I'm really excited to be joined today by a panel that includes Tony Pan, who's CEO and founder of Modern Hydrogen, Ross Eisenberg, who's president of America's Plastic Makers, Chris Powers, vice president of carbon capture, utilization, and storage at Chevron, Jean-Francois Nollet, who is senior director of global government affairs at INCRIM, and Eric Oswald, vice president of advocacy and policy at ExxonMobil. So let's dive in, gentlemen. Ross, I want to start with you. There's an implicit chronology in terms of how the world achieves an emissions-free future. And with countries having many mid-century goals, companies adopting interim benchmarks, I think the most frequent one we see cited is near zero methane 2030, as that kind of bubbles up as a top topic. What's your assessment of the credibility of these timelines, and what do we need to do to accelerate this emissions-free future?
So thank you, by the way, for having me. I'm Ross Eisenberg. I'm with the American Chemistry Council. My title as of 10 days ago is President of America's Plastic Makers, which is essentially the plastic manufacturing sector within American Chemistry Council. Broadly, we are the trade association for the chemical industry, the business of chemistry, responsible for about a quarter of GDP, $600 billion worth of growth. We are a hard to decarbonize sector, right? So I think I'm going to focus a little bit on us to try to answer that question. Certainly we've seen, goals are good. Goals are very, very good. They are a good market signal. The vast majority of our members made decarbonization goals, either to get to net zero or something like it. And obviously we're very careful as they thought through what they could get to and how they were going to get there. But goals are important to put out there so that you can either get there or have something to shoot at. That all being said, for our sector, looking at, we've done the work. We are extremely difficult to decarbonize, right? There's the beauty of our sector is that the products we make are beneficial, are necessary for decarbonization, whether it's EV batteries or semiconductors or renewable energies. I mean, a wind turbine is essentially plastic. All of these things, we are integral to that. So we are the things that go into the things that you're going to need to decarbonize. And we need to get more of those into the market, which are opportunities for us. On the flip side, we are extremely energy dependent. We use it as not only as an energy input, but as a feedstock input to make the chemicals that then go into everything else. And so it requires some massive, there is no silver bullet. It requires massive technological innovation to get to some of these goals. We're confident that, they're all chemical engineers. They're confident they can figure this out. But it's not going to be easy, and it's going to be very, very difficult. So, I certainly don't have to tell you, you're seeing a lot of press lately about companies and governments and everybody else kind of saying, well, we're still trying, but maybe we need to rethink sort of the aggressiveness and how we get to different places. I think that probably is true everywhere, and certainly in our sector. So as a dose of reality, there are technologies that we're really going to have to move quickly on to get there. Near term, CCUS, hydrogen, efficiency at our plants. You go beyond that, you start talking about things like small modular nuclear reactors, electrification of steam cracking, which, really kind of moonshot type things that, we're going to need that to get there and, kind of making chemicals differently than we've ever made them. But these are very, very challenging things to get to. So, I'm trying very hard not to be, the cold water on this, but, it's good to have goals. We should keep these goals. But they are very, we're seeing out in real time that they are not going to be easy to reach.
Ross, I think the emphasis on technology in particular is really helpful here because there's a really wide variety of panelists today to talk about the different aspects of technology that can help achieve the future that you just outlined. And I think in terms of the policy conversation that I'm witnessing here in Washington, certainly in the energy transition conversation and dialogues that are happening in the context, for example, of the UNFCCC process and COP28, one issue largely stands out, and it's methane, which I think there's a lot of prioritization around. Jean-Francois, a lot of times people are thinking about methane in the context of just oil and gas, but I think, carbon and methane emissions from waste offer significant contributions to global emissions as well. And it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on how, how can the manufacturing of biofuels and chemical solutions address waste emissions? What kind of industry is this going to inspire? And what kind of support does it need to get off the ground?
Sure. Thank you, Lyndon. And first, thank you very much for having me. Thank you to Cres and the National Energy Week. So My name is Jean-François Nera. I work for a company called Enerchem. So we have developed a waste to biofuels and chemical gasification technology. So what we do is that we take waste, could be our waste, municipal solid waste, industrial waste, commercial waste, also biomass and ag waste as well, and we transform that waste into high-value products. So in this case, our platform is methanol, which is also a simple alcohol as ethanol, but is a building block for the petrochemical industry. So we target the hard-to-abate sectors, mostly aviation and marine sector, but also the chemical sector. And we know that it's a challenging sector to ultimately to decarbonize, but by using our molecule, we can help doing it. We can help doing it. So why, in fact? So by diverting waste from landfill or incinerations, then obviously we avoid the emissions coming from landfill or the incineration of it. So we get the credits of it, and then ultimately it helps us to have the lowest carbon intensity molecule ultimately to target those sectors. Now, it is challenging, right, to do, right? So obviously, talking about the complexity and especially the chemical industry is very energy intensive, but we can work on all sides, right? So, Ross mentioned, the work that the industry is doing to ultimately help in reducing emissions from the energy side of things, but you can use, low carbon molecules also and blend it in helping in producing the materials that we need, obviously, right? And we can talk about the challenges around that. But that's what we do in a nutshell.
Well, I appreciate it. And while methane is an element of the near-term aspect, and I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space, mid-century ambitions also include a lot of conversation around CCS, CCUS, and Cres, I want to turn to you to talk about Chevron's vision, how Chevron envisions the expansion of that industry. You and I had an opportunity to speak a little bit before we jumped on this panel, and recognizing how much is happening in the United States right now. So, what do you envision the expansion of CCUS here in the U.S., and what's required for widespread implementation of these technologies?
Thanks, and again, pleasure to be here. I appreciate everybody coming out to talk about a very important topic that affects all of us here, and we've got to work together to move the ball down the field. So specifically to CCUS, look, we're a firm believer, and we've said it many times publicly, that CCS is going to be one of, if not the most critical enablers to achieve net zero ambitions around the world globally. So there's a lot of steps to make that happen. Look, CCS projects have progressed slowly in the past. That's for sure. And I think part of the reality is these are big, complex projects, and that's part of the reason that you see a lot of projects talked about, but then in terms of moving real projects down the field, it takes big companies that have experience building big projects and working across the full value chain from subsurface to surface facilities to operations to make it happen. And that's why Eric, my colleague up here, another good example of a company leaning forward in this space. But it's not only the projects, it's also the enabling policy. And that's an area where I think we need to continue to, okay. See, God agrees, it's the policy. We've got to move the enabling policy forward, right? So IRA was a big first step, but there's so many additional steps that need to happen in terms of the implementation of these important policies that have been put in place, and then how you execute these across the U.S. and around the world. And we think about things like my portfolio. We have projects in 3 EPA regions, consistency of regulations, surety of how I execute something in Region A, Region B, and Region C. That's going to allow us to expedite the process, move the projects forward in a more efficient and effective manner. And also, I will wrap with this. CCS is going to be one of the pieces that's going to be critical. It's going to also take hydrogen. It's going to take biofuels. It's going to take green power. It's going to take all of these solutions to meet the energy demand for the U.S. and for the world. And we need to move all of them down and let the market choose the winners and losers.
Well, it appears Cres was insightful here because they happen to also include hydrogen on the panel. So we're going down Cres's lineup, and I think that's a great transition to you, Tony. Global discussions of hydrogen as a clean fuel source in the energy transition are obviously increasingly popular. Frankly, there's a pretty fervent debate going on right now here in Washington around the tax incentives that the IRA provides for hydrogen. And I think, it benefit just an understanding of the application of this sector and how you would characterize the growth of the hydrogen economy going forward. Let's just get a foundational view, and then I'm going to come back to you with one more question.
Great. So thanks everybody for being here. We're modern hydrogen. We basically decarbonize natural gas into clean hydrogen. And as you said, hydrogen's a hot topic. I think most experts recognize we need hydrogen to go to actual net zero. It is a critical part of decarbonization, especially in industry. And so we're seeing hydrogen getting uptake and interest in things like industrial processes, manufacturing, long distance transports, etc. And for us, our company, we're seeing a lot of interest in hydrogen from utilities. I think that's very interesting. If you think about our nation's utilities, right? Our utilities serve 330 million Americans and basically all our millions of businesses and factories, and they're saying hydrogen is required. And I would give them some credit of knowing what they know what they're talking about, because they are interfacing with their customers, and we're hearing discussions from utilities where they're saying, hey, I have a customer and they're trying to decarbonize your factory. They've already decarbonized 100% of their electricity load, but they've only met like 20 or 30% of the decarbonization target, because the rest of it is like using fossil fuels that they don't see possible to electrify, right? As you've mentioned, like it's not just hydrogen as an energy source, sometimes hydrogen is a feedstock. How the hell are you gonna electrify a feedstock? It's not possible. So we're gonna need hydrogen. And in particular for us, we've seen very strong interest from gas utilities. So we talk a lot about natural gas in our company because as a nation, right, I like to tell folks, natural gas we use as much natural gas as coal, plus nuclear, plus hydro, plus solar, plus wind. All of that combined, same size of natural gas, and then the US exports even more natural gas. So the gas utilities need to find a way to be part of the clean energy solution. And it turns out they're kind of like hydrogen utilities in the sense that natural gas, methane, it's CH4. It's 80% hydrogen already by atom count. So if they really want to find a solution where they can just strip the carbon out of their natural gas, then they can provide clean hydrogen, and this is how they can massively increase the scale and the speed, frankly, of decarbonization.
So just building on that really quick, how much of a panacea is hydrogen? Is this going to be, as the Department of Energy, for example, announced hydrogen hubs, is this going to be a point of use kind of industry, or do you see a broader geography building around the hydrogen economy?
That's a fantastic question. And in fact, it sets up a bit of a false choice there, but let me explain. You're asking about something really important. So people talk about hydrogen as a Swiss Army knife of decarbonization, because basically, if you can't use an electron directly and you want to use some kind of fuel, well, hydrogen's the holy grail fuel that burns without CO2 emissions. But, a very big but, hydrogen is one of the hardest fuels you can imagine to transport and distribute. Hydrogen is the lightest element in the universe. It's like the opposites of compact. It doesn't want to be moved around easily, and therefore, the International Energy Agency says in their summary report, forget about trying to produce clean hydrogen cheaply. If we have to move it a long distance, triple the cost in the long term. In our current customers, many of them see a 10x markup because of the logistics challenge of getting hydrogen where it needs to be. So transportation for hydrogen is a huge issue. But again, we make the observation that natural gas is one of the biggest energy sources on the planet. In the United States, we have 3 million miles of transmission and distribution pipelines for natural gas compared to less than 2,000 for hydrogen. So 3 million versus 2,000. So if you could actually leverage the natural gas grid to move like hydrogen around that's attached to a carbon atom, and then at the very last step, you strip out the carbon atom, then you can actually provide local hydrogen production at broad geographies. So you can have your cake and eat it too. You're not stuck with the competing of like, do we make hydrogen in a central hub and spoke model and then have to move it around? There's some way to circumvent all of that.
All right. Well, so Eric, I want to pivot to you to pull the pieces together here. Obviously, I alluded to the fact that the U.S. government has been busy thinking about ways to incentivize a clean energy economy, and I'd be interested to hear how successful you see these policies being for the oil and gas sector in particular, and what projects is this beginning to inspire from Exxon's portfolio?
Yeah, thanks, Lyndon, and thanks for having me here. Maybe just a way to kind of paint that picture. In early 2021, ExxonMobil started the Low Carbon Solutions Company. I was employee number 4. There's hundreds now kind of going around working on that business, which the mission of that is to decarbonize ExxonMobil's operations and the operations of our customers around the world. So today we've had about $17 billion of committed funding to that enterprise, and that's not including a recent $5 billion acquisition that's being considered on the Denbury pipeline. So a substantial amount of capital going towards it. I'll just talk about some of the projects as a way of illustrating at least the things we've publicly announced here in the US. There's 3 CCS projects, carbon capture projects, that sum up to something like 5 million tons of CO2 being put away every year. That's like 2 million cars being converted from ICE vehicles to EV vehicles. So it's a pretty substantial difference. And I guess 2 points about those 3 announcements that we've made. First, they're all contracts, so a customer has agreed and signed, and we have a contracted relationship, so that's moving ahead, and if it doesn't move ahead, that's our problem, so we need to progress those contracts. And then second, those are contracts with a fertilizer company, a steel company, and an industrial gas company. So that's not really about the oil and gas industry perpetuating its operations or decarbonizing its refineries. Those are whole new industries that need to find ways to decarbonize, and this service, the CCS service, is integral to doing that. Another big announcement around Baytown Blue Hydrogen. It'll be probably the largest clean hydrogen facility in the world. It'll produce something like 1 billion cubic feet of hydrogen. That'll be up and running in 2028. I think it comes to FID in 2024. So it's a real project. The bulldozers are already clearing ground. It's actively being worked. That's an exciting deal going to this hydrogen economy because part of that hydrogen will be useful to decarbonizing our facilities that are just directly adjacent to where this is being built at the Baytown refinery. So you're replacing methane that's burning in the refinery with hydrogen, which burns clean in the refinery, and then you can take the CO2 and sequester it so that you have a zero carbon solution. And then there's many other solutions. You can sell hydrogen to your neighbors so that they can do something similar with their facilities. You can convert that hydrogen into ammonia, and then ammonia has all kinds of different possible uses and a greater ability for transportation. So that's an exciting, I think, big step into the hydrogen world that we've made. And then finally, I mentioned the Denbury pipeline, which we haven't closed on. That's still under consideration. But when you look at Denbury, that's 1,300 miles of CO2 pipelines, 900 miles of CO2 pipelines in the Gulf Coast area with an enormous number of sequestration sites. So it builds a network that has an enormous amount of optionality and flexibility when you're trying to sequester CO2. So a lot going on, and I guess to your answer, the recent legislation, the recent policy moves, that they're facilitating this initial foray, and we're excited to see customers coming forward and able to sign real contracts, to get the businesses going. But I think there's a lot more work to be done. As Cres has said, this is a way to get started, but it's not the policy solution that's going to ultimately get us to where we need to go.
Really appreciate those comments, Eric. This is a quick moderator PSA, just to note that we can take questions from the audience. So if there are any, please, we'll have some mic runners over here that can flag them, and I'll come back to the audience in a minute here. So I want to pivot back to you, Ross. This isn't just, the industrial transformation is not just an American story. Obviously, there's a lot of thought going into this globally. In particular, I think about the circular economy conversations out of Europe. What's your impression in terms of that policy framework for your industry? And if that's not optimal, what policy frameworks are going to make for a vibrant plastics industry here in the United States?
So, excellent question, and the short answer is we think that's the exact right place to be. We very much want a circular economy for plastics. It is the path forward to use plastics and to manufacture them responsibly and use them responsibly. We as an industry have committed to that. The America's Plastics Makers, we have a 2030 goal of 100% of all packaging has to be recyclable, reusable, and essentially designed for that. By 2040, the goal is that it all has to be essentially reused, recycled, refilled by 2040 of all packaging. Ambitious goals, much like climate, right? So how do we get there? We've put a number of solutions forward as an industry, but obviously our goal is to make sure that we hit these goals. We've called for at the federal level, and we certainly are engaged internationally on the Global Plastics Treaty, at the state level on things like producer responsibility and things of that nature. Federally, we are right now asking Congress to do a number of things. We have something called our 5 Actions for Sustainable Change Plan. It essentially sets a mandatory 30% recycled content target in all packaging by 2030. It updates the policies and the regulations around recycling so that we can improve access and everybody kind of knows what the rules of the road are. We are open to the concept of producer responsibility. We as an industry are willing to put our skin in the game into that conversation as well. And equally important for us, regulating advanced recycling, which is a technology that essentially takes the plastic, end-of-life plastic, and turns it basically back into plastic through essentially chemical technologies, a number of chemical technologies, creating a policy framework so that can actually start penetrating we can start building those out in the U.S. in an industrial scale capacity, so that we can take in those hard to recycle plastics, the bags, the films, the things like that, and just turn them right back into plastic and create this circular model. That is the pathway forward. Incidentally, it actually is a greenhouse gas improvement, so it actually is relevant to this conversation as well. Whether it's compared to landfilling or even just making virgin plastic, it is still better. And so we very much see that as the future.
Keeping on the topic of the circular carbon economy, or circular economy, I should say, Jean-Francois, the development of the plastic circular economy is, I think, seen obviously, as Ross is articulating here, as crucial to decarbonization of the plastics manufacturing. But apply this now to the chemical industry as well. What steps need to be taken for the success, in your opinion? Are they consistent with where Ross is going? Is it something else?
Yeah, so I think that, to echo a bit what Ross was saying, this is the next frontier at one point, right? Just on the panel before, we talk about, I think that we're finding solutions in decarbonizing the energy sector, right? It's not done, not easy, but, we have a path forward. Now, transportation, hard to abate sectors, I've mentioned aviation and marine, great. The chemical industry is the next one, right? How to incentivize, how to support that transition ultimately. There are many ways and many pathways to reach that, right? And I did mention, I just want to go back of, what I was saying at the beginning. So we're using waste in our process, in our gasification process. And I just wanted to mention that this is not a pilot, it's real. We're building a $1.2 billion facility, Canadian, but still just out of Montreal. And the sponsors are Shell, Suncor, and Proman, right? It's coupled with a 90 megawatt PEM electrolyzer. It's currently under construction, will be commissioned in 2025. My point there is that the feedstock we're using, hydrogen, but also waste, we end up with a product, with a methanol in this case, that is 80% biogenic, right? That will push into the fuel sector and helping and reducing emissions, very low CI. But we have maybe 20% of that product that is non-bio, right? That could go back into the circular chemical processes to decarbonize that sector. And the reason why we have that portion of the product that is non-bio is that in the municipal side waste, there are some non-recyclable plastic, right? Highly contaminated plastics, or that cannot be recycled from a mechanic process. So we recycle it from a chemical point of view, right? And that portion, then we can push it back into the petrochemical industry. Now, looks great, right? Why it doesn't happen, right? It will soon at one point, we hope, but there's still work to do to make sure that ultimately we help and support the sector, and making sure ultimately that consumers are still able to, to go through this energy transition, right, and to procure and to buy those products. So it's finding some very, I think, intelligent ways in developing policies here in the US, but also globally, to make sure that everyone is on the same level playing field here. But having technology like ours, but also coupled with others, right? Because it will be a flurry of solutions ultimately for that sector.
Well, I do want to take the conversation back to the enabling environment and the policy frameworks that are going to see this industrial transformation take place. But before I do we have any questions from the audience? This is an opportunity here. Okay, got one.
Just a very quick question for Eric and Chris. Some have suggested that a price on carbon, and Exxon management is on the record as saying a price on carbon would be helpful in kind of moving forward. You've said several times that the IRA is not the last bit of policy needed. Is a price on carbon part of that from your perspective?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Eric, feel free to chime in. Look, I think we're both on the record for saying that a price on carbon is one of the most efficient, effective ways to let the market speak, let the best technologies win on a level playing field without anybody picking winners or losers, right? So carbon is an externality, it has an impact. Putting a price on it is a simple way to let all these emerging green technologies and then the most prudent and efficient, effective operators compete and let the best projects and technologies come to the fore. So I think it is a mechanism that could have a significant role to play in this space. Until we get to that point, what we have to rely on are the policies that are put in place to really get this industry moving, the decarbonization industry moving. And IRA, IIJA, these are great starts, but there's a lot more work to do, which we can maybe talk about more in a few minutes, Eric.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, Chris. I'd echo exactly what Chris said. Maybe adding, what we're going to face is there's a huge amount of the industrial sector that needs to be decarbonized that's not covered by current policy. So something simple like CCS, we have a credit for $85 a ton. There's an enormous part of the abatement curve that's say $100 to $250 a ton. So how do we get at that? Well, two things are going to happen. One, we'll work the technology side, and as things scale up, we'll get costs down. So we're trying to drive the costs down as close as we can or below that $85 credit. That's an uncertainty on where that's going to go. And then the other element is we need to reconsider as that policy matures, you have to consider, well, is there a better mechanism? Is there a better policy vehicle to capture the next part of the abatement curve? I completely agree with the economy-wide price on carbon. Maybe one way to think about that is if that's the ultimate destination, what does the journey look like? And are there intermediate steps in, say, sectoral policy that would be useful for the company? So sort of accomplishing the same thing, but just stretching across a sector or a subsector before you move to the broad economy.
Well, let's keep building on this. So if a carbon price is the elegant solution, there's a rationale on why we have the IRA, why we have the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's because we can't achieve that domestically, much less internationally. And Chris, I'm really interested in your perspective on the legislation that has been passed and the mechanics of that, how it's inspiring investment in carbon capture technology. Is it doing enough? I think, Eric, you alluded there to maybe a 2.0 of this almost, the next iteration of policy. Let's start with you, Chris, and then maybe, Eric, you might want to jump in as well.
Yeah, Landon, I'll build starting on a couple of points that I think Eric and I both touched on. When I think about these big projects, I think about three things that I usually talk about. It's going to take policy, innovation, and partnership, and we've touched on those a little bit now already. So partnership, I'll start there. That's the simplest one for everybody to understand. No one company is going to do this on their own. It's going to take different types of companies working together, technology innovators, big incumbents like ourselves. It's going to take stakeholders. It's going to take the local community. It's going to take federal, state, and local governments to put in place the frameworks to move these projects forward. So that's the partnership piece. Innovation, we've touched on. The cost of capture on many of these projects, CCS in particular, is the biggest component. If you want to think about a simple analogy, right, for very concentrated streams of CO2, the cost is relatively manageable, but many of the streams that come out of industrial processes or combustion processes, 3 or 4% CO2, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of equipment to capture that CO2, and consequently the cost is higher. So we need to keep driving innovation forward in order to bring costs down, and as Eric mentioned, bring more of the CO2 into the abatement curve in a manner that we can actually execute today. And then the last piece, though, is policy, right? So again, some of the policies that have been put in place to date are good foundations that are going to enable these businesses to start growing over time. But it's going to take so much more, not only additional policies like the 2.0 that Eric referenced, but even how we implement them, right? So it's very easy and nice to say we've implemented a policy and okay, go forth and execute. But the challenge is you actually have to work these through the various agencies that are that have stewardship over things. For instance, Class 6 permits might be a good example, right? So for those who aren't aware, any CO2 that we want to inject for permanent sequestration requires a Class 6 well. There's currently a pretty protracted process to acquire those permits through the EPA, and that's administered through the various EPA regions. So going through the paces of learning how that's going to be done, and then building the fluency on both sides, I think in terms of improving the application quality, but then also on the processing end, having the staff, the resource, the capability to move those through quickly. If that ends up being the critical path on these projects, then that's going to slow down our journey to implement CCS and other similar new energies technologies at scale. Eric, you want to add?
Yeah, just second your point there, Class 6 permitting and primacy, those issues, those are on our critical path. Those are severe issues that are going to prohibit us from realizing all the value, in the IRA. And then the rulemaking that needs to be done associated with these 45Q and 45V. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to get clarity on rulemaking so that we know exactly how those processes are going to work and what the investments are going to look like. But I would just come back to the permitting. The permitting is a make or break issue. We're not going to be doing any decarbonization unless we work this permitting issue.
All right, do we have any additional questions from the audience? Well, partnership, innovation, and policy. Chris, you highlighted those three elements. I want to key in on one of them, innovation in particular. 10 years ago, when people looked at forecasts for net zero or a clean energy economy, it was often prescribed, maybe there's an element of hydrogen, certainly there's an element of CCS, electrification, but there was often a gap that said, 30% innovation. We have to innovate new technologies. And for some reason, that has become less, we feel that we have to prescribe that gap now. And I think innovation is really a key component of this whole dialogue. Nowhere do we need to innovate more, Tony, than in the hydrogen economy. I think the U.S. Department of Energy is putting out roadmaps, thinking through these issues. You talked about some innovation just in terms of application. I'd like you to build on that. What does the energy roadmap for hydrogen look like here? Is the Department of Energy, our policymakers, encouraging clean hydrogen production? And what kind of innovation are you looking from the sector for the next step?
Yeah, I actually want to give a shout out to our policymakers, right? In addition to the Department of Energy roadmap on hydrogen, which first of all, I think the most important message is just educating folks that, yeah, indeed, the experts say hydrogen is required for deep decarbonization. But on the question of carbon tax and trying to be smart about it, don't pick winners and losers, right? You have to give credit to the folks who wrote the IRA, especially for the 45V subsidy on hydrogen. Indeed, it's doing the right thing. It's a measure what matters law. Basically, the amount of clean hydrogen credits you get from the IRA, it doesn't pick winners and losers, doesn't care if it's blue, green, pyrolysis, doesn't care about my technology. It just looks at how much CO2 emissions are created per kilogram of hydrogen that's created and bases subsidy based on that. That's exactly what you would want to do. And that also helps innovation because frankly, it sets a level playing field for new creations to come into being. And so I think really the main point here is, as you said, right, the big fight now is making sure that the intent of the law, that intends to be technology agnostic, solution agnostic, just look at the outcome, that is carried through the implementation of the law at the Department of Energy, at the Treasury, that intent of the law sticks in place. I think that's very important.
You know, broadening this conversation out from the very domestic focus, I think a lot of the policy that's being put in place is being done to incentivize American competitiveness, not just domestically, not just with the internal market, but as an export market, as being able to reach the global market. Eric, you know, given the global portfolio of Exxon, and we talked a little bit about the relentless international travel schedule, so I know you're thinking about these things in the context of a much bigger portfolio. How is the policy here domestically inspiring the competitiveness of the U.S. Industry globally? And do you see this somehow emanating in next steps to other markets globally from what we're doing here in the United States?
Well, maybe the first point I'll make is that we're exporting policy. That when I travel around the world, there's a tremendous interest in what kind of policy has been put in place. In particular, the 45V. It's something that a lot of countries in Asia are trying to understand and see if they can build something similar. So that's a very interesting development. We spend a lot of time trying to communicate that overseas. I think the U.S. is in a real leadership position here, because we've been blessed in the Gulf Coast area with a lot of good cards. I mean, the geography, the geology, the fact that all these point source emissions are sort of gathered close together along the coastline really lends itself to using CCS and hydrogen as primary decarbonization tools to work the industrial sector and do it at a cost that really nobody else can compete with. So I think it's on us. It's the policy is in place to at least get started on this, and it's on the operators to kind of step into this in a big way and really lead the world by example in doing this. Because once you've demonstrated that you can build a functioning blue hydrogen plant, or that you can execute on a TNS contract on a CCS project, around the world, customers are paying attention. They're watching very closely to what's happening here. And if we can't do it well here, it's going to be very tough to accomplish it in Europe or in Asia. So that's the main reason, we're very bullish on the Gulf Coast. We've got a lot of investment going into the Gulf Coast. A lot of our announced projects are there. We'll see that grow. We're pretty confident we'll continue to see that grow. And I think that'll be kind of a banner for the world to look at in decarbonization.
Jean-Francois, as our lone international rep here, albeit from a very friendly country to the north, I'm curious if you see it similarly. How is this policy, how is this effort for abating emissions in the industrial base impacting global trade and energy relationships? Are there potential for foreign policy challenges that could arise from this? Is it all positive, or should we be watching out for some headwinds as well?
Well, first, I agree with Eric when he says that the U.S. is exporting policies, right? Because the entire planet is looking, right? And I think when the IRA was announced, I think the rest of the world was a bit shocked, right? And for a reason, because I think some countries, including in Europe, including Canada, were looking for the last 10 years at the U.S. saying, well, what are you doing, in supporting the energy transition? And this IRA package is a real game changer, right? But I think it took Europe and the rest of the countries out there a bit by surprise, right? And in fact, looking at Canada, where I'm from, Canada was the first country to respond to the IRA in the fall 2022 in what is called a fall economic statement. They said, well, we're coming with some policies, right, to see, to try to at least match or at least to be as competitive as the different fiscal measures will be in the IRA. And then Europe came, right? And then the EU is playing a bit catch up, right? They were working on regulations for the last 10, 15 years, and then they realized that their stick needed to be matched with a carrot, if you want, right? So at least, I think it has a good overall impact for the industry, right? Because it put back the focus on those sectors, energy transistors, and in most cases, those policies are technology agnostics, and they should be, right? They should be based on CI, and ultimately the market will choose and decide what's best in a given market to go forward. But I think, here in the US, in the Gulf, and other regions, very, very blessed and very, very, very well positioned, then I think other countries are as well, right? And I think the one thing that we don't
we don't look enough at is the pressure ultimately that it will put on the supply chain, right? And on the manufacturing capacity. And I think that sector will catch up at one point, but in the very, in the initial, short term, medium term, it will be very challenging on the hydrogen side of things, electrolysis and others, and even on CC. So I think, the pressure on supply chain, because of those policies, will be real, and will be to be careful and to look at it.
So as we wrap up the conversation today, I want to go back to Ross and then Chris with a similar question here. A big part of this is about building a market and having a new economy around a decarbonized industry. So, something we had talked about when we discussed this a few weeks back, actually, was this idea of decarbonization as an industry, emissions as a service. I mean, really, how much of this, from a market outlook, Ross, is going to drive the success of where the plastic industry goes? And then, Chris, certainly for what you're working in the CCS space.
Well, certainly plastic. I think all chemistry, right? I mean, just judging from our own membership and the demand signals we've been getting from our own members, literally from the day that either CHIPS Act or IRA or IIJA was signed into law, they are in. I mean, these are massive opportunities for them that they're looking to take advantage of, whether it is, literally any of the things we're talking about here. So, these are great opportunities to decarbonize, right? Half of your car is plastic, right? If you, spray foam insulation, if you actually put spray foam insulation in all the homes in the United States, it's like taking 40 million cars off the road every single year, right? I mean, there are huge opportunities here to, as you said, essentially, turn this into a market for essentially decarbonization technologies. We are the backbone of that. We see tremendous opportunity. I think we're going to continue to see that as the policies like the ones that we got last year continue to mature.
Chris, same question.
When I think about what Chevron's trying to do in this space, we're trying to both lower the carbon intensity of our own operations, but then also, and more predominantly, grow new third-party new energies businesses. So I look at our anchor project, Bayou Bend on the U.S. Gulf Coast between Houston and Beaumont-Port Arthur. We actually don't have any substantive emissions to speak of in that area. This is not where our refineries or upstream operations are concentrated, but we see a number of industries that are going to need CCS as a solution to lower their carbon intensity because of where they're at on the abatement curve, because of the longevity that those operations will need to be in business. So for us, that initial anchor project is strictly a third-party facing CCS as a service business. So the answer is yes. I think there is going to be CCS as a service and decarbonization as a service. And the secret sauce is going to be, again, to go back to get that right mix of policy, the policy, how it's written, and then how the rulemaking is done so that it can be implemented efficiently and effectively, and then the right technology innovation to continue to drive the costs down, and the right partnerships to get the like-minded emitters and sequesters to come together to make these projects a reality.
This is a great conversation. I think for the audience here, I hope you feel an aura of optimism around the industrial economy of the future. Obviously, there's a lot of thought going into this, and I think that there's a degree of optimism in this pumpkin spice latte season. As we move forward to the holidays, though, note for Eric's call on permitting reform. I think that's definitely on the holiday wish list, and really appreciate each of you making the time to join us today. Great conversation. Again, thank you to Cres for this event, and look forward to the next panels and the discussion.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Landon Darrence, and to our panelists for a really engaging conversation. I share the optimism. I think a number of good themes came out. It is my delight to turn to our second panel discussion. Thank you very much to Landon Darrence and our panelists for an engaging conversation on reducing emissions in the industrial sector. I think there's a number of important key themes that came out of it. It is my delight to turn things over to Lisa Jacobson, who's the president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy and a friend of Cres, to lead this next conversation about industry efforts to deploy innovative energy solutions. So I'll turn it over to Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy. And big applause for Cres and Chrissy in particular for pulling all these panels together. Again, my name's Lisa Jacobson. I'm president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and we're very proud to once again be a strong partner of National Clean Energy Week, and we're going to have a great discussion this afternoon. And yeah, so our focus is innovation. Innovation in the marketplace today. So our title for all of you is Powering the Adoption of Innovative Clean Energy Technologies. And I know we've all been in discussions on innovations here in Washington or around the world. And I think in this particular moment in time, it's really important to think about where we are in terms of how technologies integrate and how we can optimize the technologies we have. But we also know that there are technologies that might still have hurdles to market adoption or scale, and they need support as well. And that's a public-private partnership support. So I hope through the discussion, we're going to get into some concrete examples of innovation projects and approaches that have been helpful, but also I think, again, we sit at a point of time of urgency to act. So as someone said, I think, I don't want to steal the headline, but as somebody said as we were preparing for this, the question isn't, whether we move fast or faster. We really have to do both, and there's a lot of opportunity to do that. So let me introduce our panelists. First, we're going to hear from John Norman, president of HydroStore. Then Dr. George Borlase, vice president of standards development for UL Standards and Engagement. Jeanette Mills, executive vice president and chief external relations officer for Tennessee Valley Authority, and Joe Mastrangelo, CEO of EOS Energy. So again, innovation. I'd love to take a few moments as we start to hear your perspectives on what are the problems we have now in the marketplace to address innovation, and really what does innovation mean for your particular company or market segment? So John, let's go to you first.
Yeah, thanks Lisa, and that was a really good introduction. I'll give you a little bit of background about HydroStore in a moment, but to kind of go to that framing for a second, it's not like entities or companies or governments innovate for innovation's sake, right? There's usually an objective we're trying to achieve. Why do we need to innovate to do something better? I think part of the reason we're all here today is we do realize, to your point, urgency of decarbonization objectives. I would just like to highlight that urgency. I've worked in the power sector for a long time. These are very long cycles, and if we're talking about targets in 2030, 2035, 2040, we're talking about net zero targets even in that time frame. That's tomorrow, right? So there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen to enable that. I think the other thing that's worth recognizing, I think building even on the last panel a bit, we're looking to decarbonize all, the broader energy system, really relying on the electricity system. The electricity system has a lot of transition to do to get to that point. And I think one of the things we don't talk about enough in the power system and power markets is how much the last real cycle of investment in the power sector was in the 1980s and 90s. Maybe I'm oversimplifying that, but that is largely true. And you're seeing a lot of retiring infrastructure now that under any circumstance we'd be in an energy transition, never mind the need for new types of technologies and not just using the technologies of the past. So when you go to what is innovation, it's not just about innovating we're an innovative company. It's also about innovating in our regulatory approaches, our market approaches, how regulators shouldn't just be acting as a brake, like we need to incent new investment. How do we get to that point? So I really look forward to this panel discussion to describe that a bit more. just to give you a quick overview of who we are and where we fit in with this. So HydroStore is a long-duration energy storage company for power. We use compressed air as our solution. So really, we're just taking off-peak electricity, running it through a compressor, storing high-pressure air underground, and then having that air run through a turbine on the grid when it's needed. It's actually quite well proven. We've improved on that fundamental basis by allowing our system to be flexibly sited on the grid where it's required. So we actually construct cavities for that purpose. And we use water compensation to keep the volume really small. The other thing we do is we don't rely on any natural gas. So we're totally fuel-free. We're a true storage asset. We're kind of like pneumatic pumped hydro that can be flexibly located on the grid. So where do we fit in with this? Well, partly long-duration energy storage is really critical if we're getting to any type of net zero target or serious decarbonization. But we're also a very good resource transitionally because we operate very similarly to a natural gas plant, and yet we're not burning any fuel. So as these facilities retire, we can locate where they're retiring and act as a bridge on the centralized grid. I mean, I know we talk about decentralized generation a lot, and we believe those are critical solutions, but I don't think we're also going to be stranding trillions of dollars of grid infrastructure and transmission infrastructure. We're going to want to leverage these points of generation injection and make sure we continue to use them with long-duration storage. On that basis, I really look forward to the panel discussion because we are a fairly well-proven technology, but we're still first of a kind in many markets. And so it's an interesting challenge. We're not really at the pilot stage. We're not looking for R&D funding, but we're building 500 megawatt, multi-hundred megawatt plants. And we've just signed one of the world's largest energy storage contracts in California the past year, certainly for long-duration storage. And we've signed an agreement as a non-wires transmission alternative in Australia. These are 200 megawatt and 500 megawatt plants. But I do have a lot of war stories to relay in relation to that and how we can continue doing this better in the future. So I really do look forward to the discussion.
Great. George.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here part of this week, especially as part of the Policymakers Symposium. Again, Dr. George Boyce, I'm the Vice President of Standards Development at UL Standards and Engagement. And there's been a lot of conversation about electrification and the word electrification, the moving from petroleum-based products that are run on petroleum to electricity, conversations about electric transmission, alternating current versus direct current, and the real fear that all of this electrification is going to cause fires in homes and buildings. That is exactly the conversation before the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. It's the same World's Fair that introduced the zipper, the Ferris wheel, I had to write this down, and the elevator. So I heard a chuckle or two because it probably sounds exactly like the conversation we're having today. And I know you're sitting there thinking, well, geez, George, what have you done in the last 120 years? Because we're still having that conversation. And I'll get to what's changed since then in a minute. But I just mentioned that because back in 1893, rather than giving to fear, William Henry Merrill, who was the founder of Underwriters Laboratories, founded a company to be able to do the safety testing that would be able to provide the assurance and the trust, well, principally to the underwriters, thus the name, but really to the public, that this technology and this innovation, when implemented, would be able to be trusted. And I recognize the irony of sitting here in DC this week trying to peddle trust, but I'm gonna give it my best shot. Because that really is, at the end of the day, maybe it's because I have a complex, but to your point about what's the problem, I see part of it is the problem of not being maybe conscious enough of how safety standards are part of the conversation of how this innovative technologies actually get implemented. Because otherwise there will be a lot of great theoretical discussions about really interesting things that sound neat, but are never actually implemented in the field. So as we talk through today, that's part of where I plan to go.
Yeah, that's terrific. Go ahead, Jeanette. Thank you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. Jeanette Mills. I'm with the Tennessee Valley Authority. I'm their EVP and Chief External Relations Officer. I've been in the energy industry over 30 years. I'm actually an engineer, even though people are surprised and say, how'd you end up running external relations? Yeah, there's a lot to that story. But anyway, as I think about where we are as an industry, I mean, it is unprecedented. I know that word is overused. We use it a lot now. When you think about electrification, right? I know we're not talking about the IIJA and the IRA, but basically shifting a lot of load to electricity. And at the same time, within the Tennessee Valley region, the 7 states we serve is one of the largest growing areas in the United States. We serve Tennessee and portions of Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, North Georgia, and smaller portions of North Carolina and Virginia. And they are growing leaps and bounds. So you've got load growth. And then you've got the need to provide affordable, reliable, resilient, and clean energy, all coming together at the same time. So when I think about innovation, for us, it's all of the above. It's really being psyched about the new technologies that are coming along and creating those partnerships, but understanding in order to manage our basic principle, particularly around reliability and resiliency, it's a delicate balancing act for us. So we generate the power, and we serve 153 local power companies, local distribution companies within that region that I described. And we also serve around 60 directly served customers. And our customers, of course, want affordable, reliable, resilient, and ever more clean power. So innovation for us is about partnerships. So we have several partnerships that I won't take the time now to talk about, but a couple examples where we try to partner with folks on things like carbon capture. We're partnering on hydrogen hubs. We're partnering on new technologies. So really to generate the power. So we are involved in this conversation ever more, but I often, this is just a joke, I shouldn't say it probably on the live stream, but I joke and I say, when we talk about all the new technologies and everything that's coming and all the additions, right, the maybe doubling or tripling of our electric system, and the challenges we have with transmission, generation, all the different distribution, all the components, we never ever talk about the possibility of the lights going out and reliability going down. So I just had to throw that out for a minute, but we are all over it in the Tennessee Valley Authority. So I think those are my opening comments.
Okay, Joe, now you can correct my misstatement of your quote.
Well, yeah. So what I said in the green room was being faster. If I win a 40-yard dash, I'm faster than someone. I'm not fast. I'm certainly not fastest. And that's what we're talking about, what we're trying to do. I don't come to Washington very often, so I wasn't sure about the dress code, so I split the difference today. But I wear this hat every day. For those of you that don't know, it's Ready Kilowatt. Ready Kilowatt came out in 1926, and he's what was used to get the United States to electrify itself, to teach you about safety and teach you about electricity. And that, I wear it because I think that's what we're doing right now. It's the second generation of that. I am the CEO of a company called EOS Energy Storage. We're an alternate technology in the fact that we are a zinc bromine based stationary storage product that you won't see in EVs, and we're certified non-flammable by George and his team. Like, they've tried to shoot nails in our product and it doesn't catch on fire, and it gives you high operating flexibility under multiple operating conditions with very low auxiliary loads. The other thing I'd say about myself, so I am a almost 32-year energy industry veteran. I spent more than half my time in oil and gas. I spent another half of my time in traditional power generation. And then I spent my time in electrical systems business working for General Electric for 26 years. And I've been with EOS for the last 5. So I'm the classic case of 26 years in a big company. God, if I had the shackles taken off, it would be so much fun to go work and innovate something and bring a new product to market. What I got asked in the back room was, what is EOS? Is EOS an acronym? What does it stand for? It's actually the Greek god of the dawn. It's EOS. But I always joke that the E in EOS doesn't stand for easy. It's hard to just innovate in and of itself, and it's harder to innovate in the power of the energy industry, because when we flip the switch, we want the lights to come on. So you've got to be really good when you bring something to market. And what we've been innovating on is just a better way. So our product, we talk about it being innovative. The patents come from 1983. They were done by ExxonMobil. They tried to do a zinc bromine battery just like ours that was a flow battery that used pumps to circulate electrolyte. What our technology people have done is they've taken that concept and solved a lot of the problems that came up back in the 80s and came up with a static battery in that we don't use pumps, we don't need fire suppression, and we don't use HVAC to keep the battery under a certain operating condition. Going and making the jump from the lab to the real world out in the field is a tough jump. You know, when you're talking about companies like, you know, what we do is there's two types, you know, I'm going to generalize, so generalizations are always wrong. There's two types of customers. You have utilities and you have developers. Developers take more risk on the technology, but they're higher risk on the implementation. Utilities take less risk on the technology, takes longer to get into their programs that they want to do, but are blue chip underwritten projects. So what you have to do when you're trying to innovate in this industry is get some developers, because the utility won't talk to you until you have a product out in the field, and then while working through the utility process, where I'll tell one of the stories, and I won't name names, but I had a utility tell me, this was 4 years ago, you're fast-tracked, we're gonna get you a PO by 2025. So it's a different time scale. Now, what we don't have is the ability to take that time to do what we're talking about. And if you look at the history of the industry, we wait so long to implement that you wind up with your back against the wall and you run out of options. You got to start, you know, if we want to do what we say we want to do in the time frame we want to do it, it's yesterday, it's not even tomorrow. So we've got to move faster and be the fastest to be able to do this.
Thank you. And I'm really glad you kind of both are getting into some concrete examples, which is what I'd like to do now as we talk a little bit more about the challenges. You know, John, you called out investors as just one of a number of partners that you seek to work with, and you don't have to only focus on investors, but you know, what are some of the challenges you face? How have you been able to overcome some of them?
Yeah, well, overcoming them is definitely an ongoing game. You know, it's funny, I joined Hydrostore about 6 years ago from a multi-decade career in the power sector as well, and you and I would have been crazy to have jumped into the sector any time prior to that. So things have been changing pretty quickly. I do think that I really appreciate your comment about just the nature of innovation generally on a very conservative sector. So that's really challenging. Like, the actual technical innovation needs to be very incremental. That's certainly the approach we've been taking. We could perfect better compressors, better approaches to have higher efficiencies. We are really just see ourselves as a systems integrator. So we're just pulling this together. We have performance guarantees. We're trying to minimize all the potential risk exposure to off-takers like TVA or our partners in California and in Australia. And our investors are sort of taking that on. And we're backed by Goldman Sachs. They see the long-term potential in this, and they're not viewing it as a venture play. But that leads me to pivot a little bit towards something that I'd really like to be part of the discussion, because I don't think it's just a case. Sometimes I think we use the innovation thing as kind of, oh, technology innovation will save the day. And there'll be a magic thing coming out of a magic box, and that will save us to hit our net zero targets in 2040. I think there's some more hard work that needs to be done. The reason I was sort of talking about the last investment cycle in the power sector was just that we actually need a lot of regulatory innovation to get any infrastructure built, even if it was entirely conventional. I think we agree as purveyors of long duration storage, we'll be part of that mix, we're confident. But there's a bigger issue in that the power markets haven't really evolved to be able to do this. And I'll give you a few examples of those challenges. I mean, some of it is just purely on the regulatory side. I'll focus on storage because that's kind of what I do, but it is incredibly difficult to have storage treated as a transmission asset while also selling market services. But if you think about that, that's a pretty absurd outcome. Right. I mean, that is just increasing costs for everybody. It is jeopardizing our ability to keep the lights on and actually hit decarbonization objectives. We've started going down that path in Australia. We're actually the case-breaking precedent for that. It's never been done in Australia. It is not an easy slog. I'll tell you that right now. I'd be happy to talk to you, after the panel, anyone who's interested about what we've been doing to move that forward. But it is not readily, I can't think of any clear jurisdiction in North America that's really has that fully figured out. And a lot of jurisdictions are even still, they can't get past storage being both a load and a generator. You know, like so they want to charge demand charges to the load getting put on. I mean, if that's the case, you're just never going to see this stuff get built. So I think there's a pathway there, but I think it does require a lot of innovative thinking with regulators. The other big piece is, you know, there hasn't been a lot of infrastructure built out. At least there has been examples of it, but there hasn't been a lot. And it's certainly not enough relative to the amount that's retiring on the power grid. And there needs to be more understanding of how these projects are actually financed. It's very lumpy infrastructure. That's why the last investment cycle was in the 80s. If we want to be able to finance these things, we need to be able to give some revenue certainty around it and contracting certainty. I don't think that's a four-letter word. I think it's something that needs to get integrated more in the power markets. And I'd love to talk about that a bit more as we kind of dive into other examples. Because if those things are solved, I think it's innovation. The private sector is really good at innovation. It's just, it needs to respond to these signals. And that's what we're trying to push towards.
Go ahead. I'd like to jump in on that if I could. So today, TVA is 60% carbon free between our nuclear fleet, our solar fleet, and our hydroelectric fleet today. And so, of course, we have a goal to drive that carbon-free generation down. But to your point, as we think about innovation and the challenges of innovation, we believe innovation around small modular nuclear reactors is important. For us, we're looking at innovation with a hydrogen hub from a generation perspective, and then carbon capture from a climate perspective, et cetera. But when we think about the challenges, we have three areas. Supply chain has been a challenge. It can be lumpy, no matter what you're doing. The second is around workforce. Can we get the right people with the right skill sets to do this work? And third, to your point, regulation. And then lastly, how do you finance it all at a pace? You know, we're public power, so we don't have shareholders, unlike other power companies. But since we are public power, we serve, of the 153 local power companies, about 100 of them are municipal utilities, and I say the balance are rural electric cooperatives. And so many of them rural. So we are very conscious of cost too. So just to your point, like how do you get the funding and the mechanism that can align with the pace of being faster, right, in order to do this for the greater good of the United States of America?
And the thing I would just build off of that, like a couple of things. So the one thing we always have to remember about this industry that's hard to explain to people is the amount of technology we need is immense. So it's a high-tech market. Who wants their power bill to go up? Nobody, right? So you're caught in this market where the end user wants to cap the ability to raise price to what we're talking about. So innovation in the market is really coming out and finding things that work from a cost standpoint that make sense in the framework of the end user. The other thing I would just add, like two other things in my career for all of us to think about, because somehow we're turning this discussion into fossil versus green, and it's not a versus, it's an and with. And storage plays a role in making both of those generating assets more efficient. The two stories I would tell is, one, I remember I was leading the turbo machinery business in the oil and gas business inside of GE, and we went and we were selling gas turbines to regasify LNG to be imported into the US, was one of our biggest revenue drivers in that business. And in a matter of months, when horizontal drilling came in, we went from taking those regasification plants and turning them into liquefaction plants to export LNG to the rest of the world. Now, what happened to the energy industry and the energy independence of our country was amazing. So you need to continue to do that because of the security it gives. And we're not going to get away from having to use fossil fuels. Like, our product is innovative with plastics, with zinc bromine that needs to be mined, plastics that need to be manufactured inside a steel enclosure. So it's a way to make us more efficient. It's a way to use more molecules in a better way, but it's relying upon what we're doing already today. And we can get very efficient about this. Like a lot of the things that we're talking about, I'm on my third round of hearing about carbon capture and sequestration, nuclear renaissance. Like these are things we talk about in cycles. Now we got to do something about it, right? The other thing I would say is like I spent my entire 26 years in GE going through localization programs. One Belt, One Road in China, Saudiization, localization in Brazil for pre-salt. I've done factories around the world as you start to build that. And I didn't start doing a US-based supply chain until I got into this company in this position. And now with the opportunity of the framework we have in place, we're creating real jobs. So like our factory is located where Westinghouse started. So one of our buildings, I look out and see the ruins of the building where Westinghouse sat and worked every day. We went from 2 employees in 2019 in that location to over 400 today, giving real people real jobs, and not just a job, but the opportunity for a career. A career that once you get into the energy industry, you can move around. There's a lot you can do. And that's also at the core of what we're trying to do. So it's make the system more efficient, continue to do what we're doing better, and create jobs in the US. Because look at the solar example, which is my second example. I was sitting running a gas turbine business watching solar and thinking, this isn't going to work with the prices that these guys that are being offered on solar. And they grew their way through China grew its way through the losses. And now where do you buy your solar panels from? We can't afford for this next generation of technology to get out of the United States. Like we've led this industry from its inception. We have to lead the next generation. We have to.
So George, we're going to come to you. You got some applause back there. So I would like you to talk about the challenges, but I also want to pivot to our last around the horn question, which is policy. So the role of policy. So maybe you could talk a little bit about challenges and then pivot a little bit to some of your thoughts on policy, and then we'll go back to the group.
Yeah, thanks. And I think on the challenges, sometimes, especially as we're talking about it in the standards world, some of it is about the framing. And I really appreciated the comment about how the technology is lagging, because a lot of the safety standards we do are for your home. In fact, you probably have 120 or so products in your home that are covered by a UL safety standard. And in the home, at the end, there's a plug, a very standard plug, 120 volts, 60 hertz. It's what for all the generation at the end, TVA is trying to make sure you get 120 volts, 60 hertz in your house, and constantly, 24/7, back to availability, when you need it. And the old model was there was a power plant that produced the same amount 24/7, and it was transmitted across those wires to your house. And now it's a very different model. You have solar, which may be creating direct current straight to your house, provides it when the sun is shining. You may have wind when it's blowing like stink, great, but on a dark, calm night, you don't have those. So where does that other generation come from? Plus the surge. What are the things you need, whether it's compressed gas for the capability for surge, the EOS type system, another battery electrical storage system. So just fundamentally, electric generation, electric transmission is very different than it was. And I think when we talk about the challenge is reframing that, because if you start talking about the old solutions and you're trying to apply some of those, that's where I've seen, especially in the standards world, that we run into some problems. And I'll give an example of then in terms of the challenges, and I alluded to using standards to engender trust. And this happened very recently in New York City with the e-bikes. There was a rapid increase in the number of electric bike battery fires happening in New York City. A lot of it was due to rapid growth of electric bikes in New York City being used by gig workers to make deliveries, et cetera. They no longer needed a car. It was the way that they were now moving around in the city. And it really became an essential mode of transportation for them. This wasn't an e-bike that they bought because they wanted to ride further on a Saturday with their friends and play Peloton, right? This was an essential piece of what they were doing. And the fires were often happening in an apartment, and there were a number of batteries that they were charging at a time. Why? Gig worker working 10 hours a day. They need more than one battery pack. They need multiple battery packs. Gig worker, not going to buy an OEM battery at 3 times the markup. They're going to find the least expensive one that their friend will make for them to charge. Why are they charging it in the house? It's New York City. They'd like to see their bicycle the next day. They're not going to charge it outside. In the winter, they're not going to charge it outside. But with the rapid increase in the fires, which were very real, and which were causing a number of deaths, not just in the apartment, but in other apartment complexes, New York City looked at it and said, we need to ban e-bikes. And, honestly, bans can be lazy, right? It was really, let's make sure they understand the risk associated with battery fires, and let's make sure they understand how this risk can actually be managed. And so made sure that New York City knew about our UL safety standard on e-bike batteries, which had been written 5 years previous, specifically to address the risk of fire, rather than banning. New York City passed a law that every e-bike sold in the US or sold in New York City rather, starting about now, because I think it was September 15th or so was the date of implementation. Every e-bike sold in New York City is required to be certified to the UL standard so that they can manage the risk of fire. And so I just wanted to kind of use that as an illustrative example of, especially when you look at how that innovative technology can be implemented, how that use of that standard can then provide a sense of the trust that the jurisdiction needed to allow it, and instead of going all the way to ban, finding a way to allow them, because they were going to be there anyway. The other thing is the absence of a standard doesn't mean that the product's not going to be there. They were going to be e-bikes. They were going to be used by the gig workers. They were essential. So the question was, what can you really do about it?
Yeah, that's a great example. I want to take some questions from the audience in a moment, so get your questions ready. Can I ask everybody just briefly to touch upon maybe one policy solution to some of your challenges? You want to get us started?
Look,
Joe?
I just think the biggest thing right now is going to be getting the permitting processes to accelerate, because the demand's there. In 32 years, I've never seen the industry move this quickly. We've got to just get through to get assets out in the field that are working. Once you go through all the steps to get people comfortable with the technology, we just got to move fast.
Yeah, I know in our area, I agree with permitting is a key issue for us, as well as we are working within our state of Tennessee, particularly around nuclear, and they've created like a nuclear advisory council, so creating that local inertia around the importance of nuclear, and we actually participate on this council to develop that workforce, going back to workforce. So it's not quite policy. I agree permitting is number one, but I wanted to put a plug in for that as well.
Thank you. John, how about you?
I actually think I definitely echo permitting, by the way. I think that's a critical one. But,
I got to go first.
Yeah. I won't dwell on it. I do think there is a certain element of going back to basics, though. And what I mean by that is we have some pretty sophisticated, complicated power markets. We send complicated signals that are changing constantly. And there's a big disconnect between the investment community, multi-decade infrastructure, lifespan that we're all building out, and how to finance against these signals. I mean, that's why nothing's getting built. Now, what is getting built? I didn't mean nothing. Obviously, we've seen a lot of clean energy being built out, which is why you're all here. But that's because there has been a specific policy push that's given financeable contract structures that's allowed it to happen. If we're going to decarbonize, keep the lights on, and replace this fossil generation, we still have a giant gap right now. Those mechanisms are not in place other than in a few select markets in the world where you're seeing us develop. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So what does basic mean? It just means plan the system, pick the attributes you need, and go procure them under a competition. That's it. It's that simple. And if you're not certain about how much you need at a particular point in time, don't try making a crazy economic structure that has short-run marginal signals. Just run an RFP on a contingent basis and say, if I need to off-ramp, I'll off-ramp. and then you can recover development costs. The model I'll leave you with on that is just sort of interesting. New York has actually done that. When they weren't certain about closing the Indian Point nuclear power plant and the timelines for that, they ran a contingent RFP that was very successful and is an important model for how we can actually advance this quickly without getting tripped up over ourselves. So that's my policy thought. Sorry, maybe it wasn't that quick, sorry.
No, it was good, and I aspire to your vision and the simplicity and practicality of it. So, and you know, we got to update our market rules. So, thank you for that, and thanks to everybody. I'm going to see if we have any questions from the audience. Spencer, do we have any, or any online? Okay.
Okay, everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So, hold on one second. Well, it went away here, but for EOS, to start, zinc is a critical mineral. Where do you source zinc, and is that an issue going forward? And I guess that can be for the broader panel too. Where do you guys get your resources, and is that an issue right now?
So, no, not an issue right now. So our supply chain, when you look at the supply chain, one of the things that we did when I came to the company is we moved manufacturing back from China and actually brought it to the US in 2018, and then went out and built a US supply chain. So when you look at the zinc bromine that we use, which is the core, I'll keep it simple, the core of what's in our electrolytes. So we have a water-based electrolyte, an aqueous electrolyte. It's very similar to the fluids that you use in horizontal drilling, so there's plenty of supply for what we need to do to grow the company. So we're not actually mining or buying zinc. We're buying zinc in a liquefied form with bromine mixed together. Bromine, on that question, the beauty of bromine, so any of you that understand how fracking works, everybody talks about getting natural gas, but the true value is the liquid associated with the gas because it's a perfect barrel of oil almost. And that's always been an offshoot of what you're doing. It was an afterthought. When you're mining lithium, one of the offshoots of lithium is bromine. So we're here to take the offshoot of that as lithium goes and ramps up in EVs.
Yeah, and I would just, from our perspective, we're a little different because we're basically an infrastructure project. So there's no critical minerals or resources required. It's very good from that perspective. But I also echo a comment you made earlier just about diversity. I mean, we need all of these solutions. We're not out there saying compressed air, that's the way to go, like that's gonna solve all year long. I am rooting for everybody. I am here, obviously we wanna build a successful company, but primarily I'm here because I wanna decarbonize the grid in our energy systems, and that's what I've devoted my life to. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room like that. We need all of this. And we need to
all of the above.
All of the above. And you know, you like examples, Lisa, so I'll give you an example, but everyone knows this example. I mean, just think back to ERCOT a couple of years ago. Very sophisticated market, really efficient. They could make the argument they have the most efficient market in the world, lowest costs, but they were reliant on two resources and nothing else. Natural gas that was built in the simplest form possible and not in a resilient way, and wind. And what happened when that system was stressed? Well, I don't need to tell you. We know what happened. And we need to plan for diversity. We need all of these solutions. And that's where the policy becomes really, really important. But we see ourselves as an important part of the mix because we are an infrastructure project that's very long life and has different characteristics.
Jeanette, did you want to comment any more on the importance of, portfolio of technologies? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then George, we'll let you probably take the last word.
I was going to, first of all, I wanted to comment too on our supply chain. We are a federal agency, although we don't receive any appropriations. So I wanted to make sure I put that out there. So we follow all the federal rules from a supply chain perspective. But from a portfolio perspective, I mean, we have a diverse portfolio today. We have nuclear, gas, we have hydro, electric, et cetera. We're looking at more pump storage. We have pump storage today. So for us, innovation around how we manage the portfolio, because it's very dynamic today. With the integration of solar, you have to manage basically the frequency on the system. So having the right innovation and technologies to keep all of that in balance is really one of our key factors that we're working on today. So that's my comment for that. Mm-hmm.
George, let's hear your response to this discussion.
No, I think hearing about the different technologies, and I also recognize you could have a panel with 82 more chairs on each wing, and you would be hearing about more of the technologies. What really struck me from the conversation is how everything is now a system. I like to say that all the easy problems are solved. It's only the hard ones that are left. That's what we've been working on the last 120 years, by the way. I didn't answer that question in the beginning. That's what we've been working on, the hard problems that are left. But so much of it is system. It's interoperability, right? Because each of these pieces need to operate now in a system where it didn't have to be before, because it was literally just generation, transmission, comes out the wall.
Well, it's like your phone, right? You want to be connected, but you don't want to be stationary. It's the same thing's happening in electricity.
Yeah, and talk about no longer stationary, the fact that when they first created the electric vehicle, you could only charge it. And now it's a rolling battery electric storage system that you plug into your house to backfeed in case you need the electricity from your vehicle. It's not even thought of just as a vehicle that runs on electricity, it's more of a rolling battery energy storage system. And I think just that systems approach and that systems thinking, which is often challenging, I think is going to be maybe the key piece. And for us, that's been a key challenge going forward. It was really easy in the past to say we tested the light bulb and the light bulb is safe. Now you're testing an entire energy system from the solar panels on the roof through the battery storage system in the house, through the charging systems, adapters, et cetera. And I think that's a key, lens that we need to look through this as we're talking about the solutions going forward.
Well, this has really been a terrific discussion, and you definitely broadened my view on how to think about innovation, given where we are in the markets and what the imperatives we have in terms of the environment, our economy, and our secure and reliable energy system. So I'd like to have everybody give a round of applause to our panel, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for that engaging conversation about how companies are innovating. I thought it was fascinating. Thank you very much to our panelists. For our next conversation, I did it wrong. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for an engaging conversation. It is my pleasure to introduce our next panelists. I would like to invite Will Atcheson with Jeffries up to the stage. He heads up ESG and sustainability work for the organization, has a tremendous amount of insight. I'd also like to invite David Boyce, to join our conversation as well. He's with Team Schroders Greencoat, and also Director Jigar Shah, who directs the Loan Program Office for the U.S. Department of Energy. And he's coming off of a long series of workshops, and so we look forward to hearing this conversation and some takeaways from this group. Over to you, Will. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chrissy. As she mentioned, my name is Will Atcheson, and I'm an ESG strategist at Jeffries, and I work closely with Shah. So look, thank you for joining us. I'm pleased, honored, and actually a little starstruck to be on the stage with David Boyce, CEO of Greencoat Schroders, and Director Jigar Shah of LPO at the DOE. Today's goal of the panel is to better understand where the LPO is today, how the private market views the LPO, and what could be done to both increase the efficiency and accelerate disbursement of the LPO funds. So let's level set the stage here. Jigar, can we get some quick color on what is the status of the LPO? How much money has been given out?
Oh, thanks for having me first. National Clean Energy Week is fantastic, I think, at the Department of Energy, we view it as National Clean Energy Year. Every day is National Clean Energy Day. But look, the Loan Programs Office, as you know, was really largely dormant before the administration came back in. And the Secretary, I think, has provided great leadership to really allow us to restart the Loan Programs Office and really get it going again. Today we've got about 167 active applicants in the Loan Programs Office seeking about $144 billion of capital. I saw Joe was on the last panel from EOS, who recently received a conditional commitment from the Loan Programs Office. And so, we've allocated over $20 billion during the administration. I think we've got more work to do, of course. And so we're excited. I do think that, obviously, we had some loan authority when we came in, but the bipartisan infrastructure law expanded our authorities. So interestingly, it was sort of a two-step process. They expanded the ATVM program to be able to do heavy trucks, aviation, locomotive, marine, and then added a few other programs like the State Energy Financing Institution program, which we have launched in a big way, and we just did an MOU with NYSERDA today that we announced. And then in the Inflation Reduction Act, we got additional programs like the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, which joins us in Title 17. And so, it depends on how you calculate how much loan authority we have. Well, we started with roughly $40 billion of loan authority, and now we have, upwards north of $200 billion of loan authority.
Great color. So look, nothing to shake a stick at, as they say, but clearly there's more to be done. So David, we just heard the status. High level, what do you think could accelerate both applications and potential disbursement?
Well, I think it's going to happen somewhat naturally, to be honest with you. If you look at just what's happened with the IRA passing last year and battery storage, right? Schroders Greencoat invests equity in kind of proven technologies, right? Really just putting the bulk of capital to work to make this transition happen. And you saw the stimulus come out this summer. I've got a stack this high of new battery projects on my desk. So I think there are other things coming down the pike that will benefit from other policies that make up the transition at large. It's not just wind and solar. I think there was just a tech panel up here, right? There's just a whole stream of things coming down. And the transition is going to probably take a lot of them to kind of be fully implemented. And so, I think, you sitting there, I think gives confidence to people to tackle those problems. I know you use bridge to bankability is a key term, but that is so important, right? It's really giving confidence to the innovators to come at these problems and have a view or a way that they can kind of commercialize the technologies and then ultimately build big businesses on the back of that. So it's really you're playing a facilitator role, and I just see all of those things just marching forward towards us over the next at least a decade. So I think it's going to happen naturally.
Great color. Jigar, let's talk a little bit about where you think the LPO should be focused today, because I want to hear where David thinks it should be focused as well.
Yeah, and the right answer, the strict answer here really is that we're focused wherever our applicants are, right? So, there's lots of sectors that I find fascinating and interesting, but if I don't have applications in from the private sector for those sectors, there's not much I can do, right? We're not an equity shop. We're not developing the projects. We're really just evaluating other people's work. I will say, though, that we've gotten, over $12 billion of loan applications in from the nuclear industry. I do think, we have a long history with Vogtle, Unit 3 coming online and Unit 4 coming online soon in that space. I think we've taken, frankly, an extraordinarily hard look at nuclear, and I've been, I think, pretty vocal about what I think is holding back the industry. We spent a lot of time with the different players. I do think that we're getting real progress. You have the nuclear liftoff report that came out with great fanfare last April, and so you're starting to see folks correcting the mistakes I think that were being made in that sector around, completing the full design before you start construction, right? So you saw the announcement between TVA, Synthos, and OPG there. You saw, the need for an integrated project delivery mechanism. And so you're starting to see utilities take seriously the fact that they don't really have mega projects expertise and like figuring out how to develop mega projects expertise. And so I think we're taking very seriously how hard it is to do these really big things and being quite humble about it and figuring out how we might do better, right? And you see similar evidence of similar efforts in the carbon sequestration and storage space, the hydrogen space, all places where we have a lot of applications in. But making sure as a debt provider, right, we're obviously enthusiastic about American innovators trying to get commercial projects built, but we also have to live with the consequences of those projects, right? Because they have to pay us back over 20 plus years in some cases. And so if a project isn't done properly or it goes over budget or, something happens, then we sort of have to do workouts, we have to do stuff. So we actually invest heavily in thinking through how to do this better, right? Than, maybe the applicants were thinking about approaching their project.
Yeah, no, fantastic insights. And I just want to lift-off reports, check them out. If you read them, you'll probably be the smartest person in the room. David, would love to hear your thoughts, right? We've talked a little bit about this. Where do you think the government should be helping? Where should the LPO step in? Where shouldn't they?
Well, there's absolutely a role, right? And it's I think a critical one. Listen, what I do for a living right now is kind of probably post the work that you've done, quite frankly, right? So I represent billions of dollars coming into the space on the back of things like solar that I think you probably loaned to 10 years ago, right? So it's just absolutely critically important that you continue to play that role. So that said, wind and solar and maybe even battery storage, certain types of battery storage today, and certain technologies that are part of the transition, quite frankly, I don't think need a leg up. I think that there are capital markets who understand the technologies, it's proven, the capital's flowing just fine, it's efficient. That's really not, I think, the ideal place for taxpayers to be using their money. Nor is it on kind of wild speculation on technology just to, see if it works, right? I think it's kind of in that in-between space where you've got technologies that have some proof behind it, really are just kind of need some execution, hasn't been done before perhaps, or not a lot, not in this country, and just really needs that extra oomph to fill the role that maybe the commercial lending market isn't quite there yet. And to the extent you continue to play that role, and again, every year, every few years, that's going to change. That's a hard job. You're going to have to follow that. But then once you get past it, right, just think about how much capital globally is behind the transition that can just pour in afterwards. That's how I make a living, right? And so I think that continuing to play the bridge role is just critically important.
Great, and you talked about this evolution. I mean, high level, is it one project built? Is it two projects? Is it 10 years like solar? Any commentary or color there?
Sorry, in terms of?
When should the government step out? Like you talked about, hey, solar's matured.
Well, listen, I mean, the first of certain things, might be a DOE loan. It might be them partnering with, commercial banks. But I think, you'll readily be able to see there's I think a lot of capital at all levels interested in the space. I think you'll kind of readily get a sense of when you're unfortunately not needed any longer, right? You'll just see the rush to capital. You'll see your applications just go, maybe through the roof just because there are a lot of projects going there. And that probably is a good sign to, maybe our role here is done and we've tackled it for that technology. So I think there'll be signs that, they've served their role.
I can probably fill in the blanks there a little bit. I think, so in the 2020 Energy Act, there was a definition of the first 6 deployments in there. So we, 2 per region. So, so there's some color there. I'd say the other piece, which David said exactly right, was that I would take the other side of it, which is that we're not an easy process to get through, right? I mean, I think we've cleaned it up and we've made it easier and we've tried to make it more straightforward. We try to follow a commercial bank process, but it's still a lot of effort to get through our office. If you can go to your normal commercial bank and get a loan there, that's an easier path, right? And so, it's pretty obvious that people are not coming to us unless they really have to use these resources, right? And so I think that part's there. I think the other piece of it, though, is that the frontier continues to be a problem for even the traditional sectors, right? So when you look at solar, for instance, they just were not comfortable with bifacial panels for the better part of 2 or 3 years, right? And then they sort of got to it late. You're seeing that now with the solar industry where, virtual power plants are still a little scary for a lot of these folks, right? So they'll fund FICO score-based loans, but then when you think about all the other revenue streams that can come in from grid services and FERC Order 2222 and other things, those are still really scary for the marketplace, right? And so when you look at the work we're doing down in financing projects in Puerto Rico, where, a lot of that stuff is things that, PREPA really needs the 300 megawatts of power walls in Puerto Rico to help balance the grid. That whole business model continues to be a little scary for the private sector.
Yep. So let's dive a little bit into capital structures, specifically maybe loan structures and tax equity financing. When you think about the DOE, or maybe we can set the stage and then David can have a few comments, how do you think about the LPO fitting in that? Where does it fit in the cap structure and can it change? Do you think it could sit sub-debt at some point?
Yeah, so we're statutorily required to be senior debt, so we can't be sub-debt or anything like that. So we have to be senior debt, senior loan, and it gets very complicated from there. So like even if we have to do scenarios around if these 3 or 4 things occur, right, are we still senior, right, or did someone else take a senior position, right? Like so from a tax equity standpoint, for instance, usually tax equity pref payments are senior to the senior debt. They're not for us, right? They have to agree to be pari passu with us, and they can't be senior in our stack, right? And so there's a lot of these nuances within the structuring that we have to work through. It frankly hasn't been a problem, but it is something that that folks have to work through. I think the other piece is I do think with the Inflation Reduction Act and a lot of the complexity around direct pay, there is a big reset happening in the tax equity space today. I don't know that, as somebody who did the very first tax equity deal in the United States in 2005, like, I don't know whether we actually know where this is going yet. Like, I've met with a lot of the folks who are doing, the new sort of exchanges for transferability. I've met with a lot of the tribes who have direct pay. I've met with nonprofits who have direct pay. But like, I feel like the heavyweights who have traditional tax equity schemes are, continuing to do that because that's familiar to them. But these new approaches that come out of the Inflation Reduction Act, I think, still have not settled very well. And so we're trying to figure out where that's going as well.
Great. Would love to hear a color.
Well, listen, I would never worry really about other sources of debt, right? They tend to sort themselves out, and I can't remember in my career that that's ever been a problem. Tax equity is a different animal, and it's a complicated one. And I'm really happy to hear you say that that really has not inhibited you from making loans. And tax equity is playing along, so to speak. But you're exactly right. There's a huge transition going on. I don't know if it's a reset or it's a lot of movement around some of the new features in the IRA about how to monetize these tax credits. And from my vantage point and just thinking about how many more tax credits there are, how much activity there is in development across all technologies that can avail themselves of those tax credits, I think we're going to probably end up in a world where we've got some of everything in terms of how to kind of monetize or use these tax credits so that they're efficient for producing cheap electricity or getting done whatever you need to get done on a cost-effective basis. So, listen, Ed, you've got a challenge ahead of you because those are definitely evolving. I would say across my desk, every 2 or 3 months, particularly this calendar year, we've seen new structures come out to tackle that problem.
Did you have something? Nope. Okay, sorry.
No.
All right, great. So David, let's actually double click on the LPO and how does it fit into your valuations? When you're doing analysis today, does it sit there? And if not, what could we do to potentially allow that to maybe work its way into the model?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult of a question for me to answer because again, I'm kind of the investor that comes in after maybe you've done a couple of your loans and you've got your tried and true commercial guys in there. But in general, no. Listen, we're paid to price equity, and I think if your loan is involved, I'm not sure if it gets priced in or not, but I do think your involvement may make an opportunity binary, where it's not an opportunity if you're not there, it is if you are there, and so perhaps. We value it just because it is actually pretty fundamental to the transaction.
Yeah, so we had the Deploy 23 conference the last 2 days. So there were about 400 companies, each one of which were committing $1 billion of investment over the next 4 years at least in all these different sectors, right? Hydrogen or next generation transmission or whatever it was. I think several of the bigger equity investors were there too. And I do think that, obviously this is always a trust building process, but I do think that today people believe that our underwriting criteria is, quite conservative and quite well done. And you are seeing when people do get conditional commitments, there is a lot more equity interest in the company, right? Because the biggest problem with these investors, as you know, is that they're just pouring through hundreds of companies. They actually can't tell the difference between them without doing a lot of due diligence. A lot of that diligence might cost several $1 million for them. Having known that LPO already did that diligence just shortcuts the process for them and allows them to more confidently support these companies. And so, I think that we're not quite there yet, but I do think that soon, LPO is basically a ticket to getting a second look from a lot of these equity investors.
Great. And you mentioned Deploy 23. I kind of just want to double click on that because to me it was a clear signal that the DOE and the LPO are stepping in a little bit more. They're going to get more involved and they're trying to educate, I guess, the market, tell them what's going on. Really, there were 4 pillars there, right? I think it was challenges, it was, it was status, challenges. Oh man,
yeah,
I'm sorry.
I won't remember either.
Sorry.
It's my cue cards are already in the garbage. But no, I think that's great. I think that the main point of the Deploy 23 conference was a couple-fold, right? One is that the vast majority of the people who are forward-leaning in their sector are a minority at their industry conference, right? When you go to the steel conference, only a few of them are actually looking to lean in and do clean steel, or cement conference or whatever it is, right? But they all share the same challenges with how we get through the commercialization process, right? America, frankly, hasn't tried to tackle this systemically over the last 40 years, right? There's been entrepreneurs who break through and figure out how to get it done. But we, as the public-private partnership, or however you want to call it, really haven't tried to do this systemically for about 40 years, right? And now I think the president's asking everyone to do this all at once, everywhere, right? And so, so a lot of those folks who are forward-leaning in each sector met each other at this conference for the first time, right? They have no reason to meet each other because they generally stay in their industry verticals. But they found that they actually have a lot of things in common around some of these financial structuring issues, some of the issues around community benefits, and some of these issues around finding qualified labor, right, to do this work, right? There's a lot of these issues that are common, And I think for DOE, we have this responsibility to not just put the money out the door responsibly, but also actually to achieve national security outcomes, right? So we don't want to just put the money out the door and say, well, we tried, but we're not leading the world in hydrogen. We also want to lead the world in hydrogen, or build out the macro grid, or figure out how we actually lead the world on carbon sequestration and storage, or make sure that people around the world use our small modular nuclear designs and not someone else's, right? And so figuring out how these companies are doing from when they announce their projects, right, to actual final investment decision is a big deal. We don't want a lot of them falling out, right? We actually want them to get to the finish line and build these projects. And one of the things that I was impressed by over the last 2 days is how much feedback we were able to get from folks, right? Because my experience in the first 2 years being in this job is that folks are quite bashful about giving us feedback, right? You'll get these sort of weird op-eds that get written and other things that happen, but there's actually no actionable information in those, right? And so when I ask people, well, what do you want me to do differently? They're like, oh, we don't want you to do anything differently. We just want to yell at you. Fine. But now you've got companies who actually do have real specific feedback saying, for instance, in the hydrogen space, they said, look, having the, giving money to hubs is great, but we also need you guys to work more on demand formation, right? And so we did a notice of intent around using some of that money for demand formation. We got some fantastic ideas from the private sector, and now there's I think an RFP that's going out here pretty soon. And so we really can only reach those outcomes with a close partnership with industry, and I think we were able to start the process in the last 2 days.
Yeah, and I had the pleasure of going, and it was a fantastic conference, so thank you. And look, you touched on something that I think that's important. Traditionally you get kind of a supply side led revolution, or not traditionally, but some of the times. And then you're taking those marginal costs, trying to steal a little bit at a time. But to really accelerate today, you need to drive demand, to really bring capital markets forward and put them to work. David, when you think about this LOIs, you hear about things like this where we're talking about creating demand. How does that fit into you? Do you start looking and allocating, capital towards that industry? Does it fit in it at all, and you need to see something first? Any color?
Yeah. Listen, I think to the extent that you guys are leaning into certain things where you want to see outcomes, and working with industry as opposed to just, hey, here's our program, apply if you want, and just being responsive. I think being proactive is actually a much more intelligent way, right, to increase the effectiveness of your program, or of anything else, right, that the government wants to do, as opposed to just sending down these things. Obviously, always to the extent that they're taking that feedback, they're listening, they're soliciting, they're pushing in, and that's a resource matter, quite frankly. You got to push in, and you got to find out what people want, what problems they're encountering before you can start solving those problems. So, it's exactly what you're doing.
Got it. And David, you and I talked about this before a little bit, but this process, and Jigar, you mentioned it yourself, it costs money, it takes a little bit of time, and then there's other loan programs or government programs, grants, et cetera, that could work their way in as well. David, when I'm thinking about what can be done to maybe help, we already had a bunch of FIDs, what can be done to maybe bring the next wave down? Transparency, timeliness, is it a map of programs? Is it a little bit of everything? I would love to hear color comments around that.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that there's a completely, one silver bullet thing that you can do that just, makes your program more popular. Like I said, engagement with companies that are bringing these projects along, massively important, right? Forcing those conversations and then being responsive to those, hugely important. And then all the obvious things, transparency, sense of timelines. I think it's all of the things. If you had a lot of expensive capital at work waiting on some feedback from you, you'd want that to be clear, concise, accurate and actionable at the end of the day. And I think if the issue is if you were doing the same thing for 2 decades, you could get into that rhythm, right? And know exactly, wind project, yeah, 2 months of diligence. I know exactly what that looks like. The challenge is, of course, is you're doing all those things, but against, kind of something that's evolving. And almost every new transaction just doesn't exactly look like what I just did. But there's certainly a lot of lessons learned. I'm sure you're bringing forward and focusing on that. So I think it's the engagement part of it, and just being transparent about what you're interested in, what you're not interested in, and what the parameters are. That feedback loop is just super critical for industry.
Great, thank you. And Jigar, I know how busy you are. David, I know how busy you are. We're running up on the 30 minutes mark here. So really, I just want to maybe what would you like, 2 quick questions. Jigar, what would you like people to take away from this? What is the most impactful thing you want people to know about, the DOE, LPO, what you're doing, how to bring the next wave forward? And then David, what is your wish list from the DOE or from the LPO? Sorry to put you both on the spot here.
Yeah, look, I think that, as David suggested, we're embarking on something quite bold and transformative here. And I think it's at the right place at the right time, right? We have all these technologies that, frankly, we invented over the last 45 years at the Department of Energy, whose time has come, right? People really need to see these technologies get commercialized, whether it's in the hydrogen space or the transmission space where, we have conductor material that, frankly, can, carry 3x the amount of electricity over the same right-of-way, right? We have, next generation aircraft design where we can power some of them with electric and hydrogen, and we're figuring out how we fund stuff on our side, but the FAA has to, certify them for flight on their side, and so there's a lot of work that we're doing across agencies as well, USDA, Department of Transportation on cement, Department of Interior on offshore wind. And so there's a lot of work that we're doing across agencies as well. One of the things that I continue to struggle with is figuring out how we get this level of education into the hands of politicians, because a lot of them actually want outcomes, right? They want outcomes in their districts, they want outcomes in their states, right? But I don't know that they understand the mechanisms and the way the policies flow into reaching those outcomes, right? And so getting that education going, not just for folks here in DC, but also governors who've made it a commitment to make a certain sector important in their state, or mayors or county commissioners, or a lot of these folks have real equities around making sure these projects happen that are in my queue. And while they're cheerleaders, right, and I get a letter of support from many of them into the office, I don't know that they know at a granular level what they themselves could do differently around making sure workforce is trained, making sure that there's actually the right risk reward around contractors and insurance policies, and what do we do with land use, and how do we deal with the circular economy in their territory where they might have a landfill that's filling up now, right? And so there's just all these disconnected problems that people are faced with every day that can be solved by technology that we've funded here in this country and entrepreneurs are trying to push. But there's the level of expertise, I'd say, in that particular elected official group is not necessarily that high, and so I think we've got to figure out how to solve that issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely important. Listen, I think it's just important to note, and the key takeaway is the energy transition, as we all think about it, and everybody in this room probably defines that a little bit differently, as I've found. But it's not just one or two things. There's no magic technology out there or a couple of things we can do, and if we just did that a lot, it would be great and we could achieve all of our goals. The reality is it's going to take a lot of different things people doing things in a lot of different ways. It's you just talked about solar and the bifacial issue. I mean, it's enhancing the stuff that we've already got and making it more effective. It's gonna take all of that stuff. But a lot of that stuff is new. So, if you want to kind of, is it a good program? Is it worthwhile? What should our government be doing? I mean, it's absolutely being that bridge, right? Not taking wildcatting risk, crazy risk. It's being that bridge between, these new innovations and getting them to a point of being commercial. And that's just not going to go away. In fact, that's accelerating, and it's going to come at us. And all of those things are going to need to happen to drive the ultimate outcome we want from a climate perspective. So, that's a great place for the U.S. taxpayers to focus.
I would like to thank both of you for joining me, and everyone who listened. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Director Shah. Thank you, David, for that great conversation. The nexus of climate and finance is so important, and it's really good to get your perspective. We're going to dive a little deeper into some of these finance issues on our next panel discussion. So I am delighted to introduce our next panel, which will be moderated by Tom Stars, who is an executive at EDP Renewables. And I'll have him introduce our other panelists. So please come on up. Thank you.
We really wanted to go boy, girl here. That's important to me. How's the couch? Cozy? Chair's cozy? How's the couch? Bolster's nice. Bolster's inside. All right, with no further ado, thank you for joining us, everyone. Again, my name is Tom Stars. I'm the Executive Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Affairs for EDP Renewables. We're a big independent power producer like all those other big independent power producers, so I'm going to leave it at that for now. I'm going to just introduce by really name and title each of the other panelists, and then we're going to dive right in. We'll ask sort of a targeted question to each one of the panelists, encourage them to add a little more information about their backgrounds or their companies in providing their first responses. After sort of a question for each, we're going to touch on a couple other questions, and then we're going to turn to you guys. So think about what you'd like to ask this panel. We will definitely reserve at least 10 minutes or so of time for questions from the audience. So be ready with your own thoughts. So with no further ado, to my left is Abby Hopper, President and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association. Full disclosure, I'm on Abby's board of directors, and we've been friends for quite a while. Next to Abby is Dan Agers, who's the Chief Financial Officer for Constellation Energy. Next to Dan is Jeannie Silo, who's the I'm going from memory, this is pretty good, Vice President of Government Affairs for Schneider Electric. And last is Andrew Wills, who is the Senior Vice President for Federal Affairs at Invenergy. All right, I did that. Wow, I can't believe I did that.
No notes, Tom.
All right, first question goes to Abby, and we're going to focus on domestic manufacturing. There's a variety of major federal bills, as we know, that have become law in the last year. I don't need to belabor them with this group, but the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, and the CHIPS Act all had something to offer in the area of domestic manufacturing. So, Abby, you're sort of at the center of a lot of the investment that's already been committed to, not necessarily delivered on, but committed to. So I want to ask you first, what's the rationale for domestic manufacturing, for focusing so much on domestic manufacturing, and what have you seen your industry members doing in response to the incentives that are out there?
Sure. So, hello, everyone. It's good to see you. If we haven't met yet, as Tom said, I'm Abby Hopper. And I saw Heather a second ago, but to Heather and the whole Cres team, thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be a partner with you. And to see so many familiar faces. Hi, Heather. There you are. Hello, my friend. So how many of you are in the clean energy space? Just raise your hand. Okay, keep your hand up if you have had any supply chain challenges or know of any supply chain challenges in the past year. Okay, if you don't have your hand up, I don't know who you are. So Tom, I think we just proved the rationale. If you think about sort of the combination of COVID and shipping challenges, and remember when we couldn't get containers or they were like 27 million times the price they were, or we have all learned a lot about certain regions of China and forced labor and sort of the integrity of our supply chains. We see kind of a whole bunch of how regulatory challenges and trade actions can really impede the progress, not just sort of theoretically of project deployment, but actual project deployment, right? And so that combined with a real desire to think differently about the way that we can incent domestic manufacturing in the United States has led to these variety of industrial policies that the United States Congress has passed. And so that, I think, is the genesis, sort of the rationale, is that business decided this is an intensely inefficient way. We have way too much risk in our supply chain, that there is political risk, there's practical risk, there's transport risk, there's COVID risk, and that bringing it home makes a lot more sense. But bringing it home, as you all know, does not just happen because we wish it were so. If that was the case, we would have done it a long time ago. So it did take a very concerted effort, a clear vision, and a lot of technical expertise to figure out what does the supply chain look like for clean energy, what is the United States really good at already, where do we have some gaps, and sort of what are the different kinds of tools we have in our tool chest, and then Congress passed a variety of those. And so what have our members and the members of the clean energy industry been doing? I like to say they've been issuing some press releases, which is great. Even better, they've been breaking ground, which is good, and some of them have already opened manufacturing facilities here. And so there are over 60 on the solar and storage side, 60 manufacturing facilities have been announced. More once you bring in offshore wind, once you bring in wind, once you bring in energy efficiency. But there's a lot of action, right? There's a lot of capital being deployed, decisions being made about where to invest. And so we look at it, it's, as I said, it doesn't happen, not only does it not happen because we wish it to, but it also does not happen overnight. And so there's a timeline at play here, but that's part of the genius of this industrial policy is that there's a timeline allowed, right? It does not, everything's going to happen by 2023, but over the next 3 to 5 years.
Tell that to our customers.
Elaborate on that.
Yeah. No, Schneider Electric, we're an electrification company. It's a great time to have the word electric in your name, actually. It's going to be, if you haven't heard Jigar's talking points on the demand that's going to face our grid, then you haven't been awake or listening to the news or reading the newspaper or his podcast or his blogs. But, we're looking at an incredible demand for electricity, and we're looking at a 3 times demand with all of the investments that are going to be including the IRA. We've invested $300 million in manufacturing, and we're going to do more. But this is for the demand of today, and we're looking at a demand in the next 10 years that I don't think the likes of which we're really ready to meet. But we've got a lot of ideas and software and capacity to do it. But it's going to take leveraging the IRA. So I'll just say, agree, long lead times, we're not there yet. Supply chain is a big priority. Mm-hmm. And for this market in the US, we're gonna have to do more to expedite investment.
Mm-hmm. Abby, do you want anything else?
No, I would agree wholeheartedly. There is lots of regulatory process happening to clarify what counts as domestic content and all of those sorts of things. But I think many of us just returned from Las Vegas, where we visited with 40,000 of our friends. in the solar and storage industry at RE+. Your CEO was there on the main stage. And if you walked around the show floor and you walked the booths, made in the United States, made in the USA was clearly a compelling differentiator between suppliers and vendors. And so we see the demand, and the customers are there, and you're right, the supply chain has to catch up.
Great, thank you. We'll move to Dan. Dan, let's talk about hydrogen. Constellation is one of the biggest operators of a nuclear fleet in the United States. And you and I chatted briefly last week, and you mentioned that one of the things that Constellation's interested in doing with that nuclear fleet is dedicating some of it to the production of hydrogen, which is, again, strongly incentivized under recent federal laws. And so I was wondering if you could just elaborate on sort of, again, the rationale for that, as well as what your thinking is with respect to both the opportunity, but also maybe some of the challenges associated with driving the investment in new clean hydrogen.
Well, first, thanks for including us in the conversation. It feels very strange to be a numbers person with a whole group of policy people, so hopefully I can hold my own. I'll probably default a little bit more to numbers where I'm comfortable, right? This is a great question.
Absolutely.
If I just take a step back on who Constellation is, right, just by way of reference, we've only been a standalone company for about a year and a half. We are the largest producer of carbon-free electricity in the United States. We make about as much clean energy as the next two largest producers of carbon-free electricity in the country, by way of context of who we are and our presence in the industry. The IRA was important. I'm going to hit on hydrogen in 1 second, but you think about the investments you guys are making. We've announced since the IRA passed just about $3.5 billion of investments we're making as a company in response to things that were enabled by the IRA, right? And that's going to be a range of things. That's nuclear uprates, that's wind repowerings, that's reinvestments in our assets to extend their useful lives to 80 years from the 60-year license life. We announced the acquisition of the STP nuclear power station in Texas, and then the hydrogen project, which is a $900 million investment that we announced earlier this year, which we're now working pretty busily on. That is a part of one of the hydrogen hub projects that's out there. Hopefully we'll get a decision on that pretty soon, but we're very excited about where that project stands, right? When we think about our role as a significant producer of carbon-free electricity, we look at it as a way of, there's a lot of places in the economy that are hard to decarbonize, right? There aren't a lot of good paths to getting there. Clean hydrogen is one of the ways to accomplish that, which is the reason why we're making the investment. That's why we believe it was part of the IRA. There's a very ambitious goal to get to 10 million metric tons of additional production by the end of this decade. By way of context, before I talk about my investment, I'll go off track one more time. Today we produce about 10 million tons of gray hydrogen. If we were to just simply replace that with clean hydrogen today, that would take all of the renewables, or almost all the renewables that exist in the United States, if they were solely purposed toward producing electricity to support the production of clean hydrogen. That's the starting point assumption. So there is a huge addressable market that needs to be addressed if we're going to decarbonize those areas of the economy. So when we went forward with our hydrogen hub in the Midwest, the goal is to help move forward on clean hydrogen, and the customers we have, which we've not announced until the hub gets announced, I guess, at this point in time, are going to be focused on things like sustainable aviation fuels. They're going to be focused on clean hydrogen or clean ammonia and other products like that, or the distribution of hydrogen for use in lift trucks and things like that. So we see a lot of use cases for it, not only for new demand, which is the right goal, but also to help decarbonize what we're already doing today.
Do you want to touch on that?
I want to connect some two dots here, because, I mean, if we need more supply in the United States for the global clean energy market, and we want to be more competitive in a global clean energy market, we want it for the United States and our own ambitions, and we want to be good at doing it for other countries too, and exporting those technologies out of the United States. And that requires a lot of manufacturing and reshoring of a more secure supply in the United States. That requires a lot of electricity. And if we do more hydrogen, which we do and we love it, and it's green hydrogen is cleaner and it's a wonderful technology, that requires a lot of electricity. The grid, I mean, is not ready to face this demand. And so I just want to connect the dots and say, part of what I'll talk about when you ask me my question is about how this IRA incentive package is also going to incentivize changes in the home and in the business that will reduce the pressure on the grid, that enables all of these other symbiotic developments to happen. So we'll go ahead and ask me my question.
You're up. No, I think I've been really looking forward to your comments, actually, because I think you and I share a belief that companies like Schneider that sort of make the power electronics and other good stuff that sort of link all these technologies together, not just at the locus of generation or storage, but also throughout the grid. I think that's a really, really crucial role to play. So why don't you riff on that? I actually did have one specific little question. You mentioned $300 million in investment in manufacturing. That's in the U.S.?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Somewhere in your answer, can you tell us a little more about that?
Over the last several years.
Yeah.
And our most recent announcement was a ribbon cutting in El Paso, Texas, which is now our biggest manufacturing facility in the United States. We had the governor.
And what's that making, just out of curiosity?
It's a number of different things that contribute to electrification, but with panels and things like that. We're contributing to the Texas economic juggernaut, which is what the governor said on the stage at the ribbon cutting, and it was a wonderful thing to hear. And Texas is a clean energy state, and it's growing, which is really exciting. But we're also investing in a lot of other places like Lincoln, Nebraska, and Kentucky, and more to come as we continue to grow. And I'll just note, in addition to the estimated $1.2 trillion in incentives from the law, IRA is what we're talking about for the most part. Goldman Sachs estimates it will create 2.9 trillion in cumulative public and private investment opportunity by 2032, and 11 trillion in infrastructure investments by 2050. I mean, this is going to be a big deal. It's a game changer. So I just want to start by saying, what do we like about it? This is going to be a big game changer for the energy economy in the United States. And to get to your point, we at Schneider Electric, if you haven't heard of us before, we make things that you find in your home or in buildings, and hotels like this, circuit breakers, the things that allow electrification, or the electrification of the building and reliable electrification. And over the last 10 years, we invested in a lot of really forward-looking companies and new technologies. We made our own products smarter and connected so they can talk to each other. We can do more real-time data analytics in a building and manage the energy more efficiently and say, okay, there's a bunch of people in here. Maybe it needs to be cooler. There's no people up there or in that room, so we can reduce the energy use there. And we started to invest in more and more companies in climate tech and software companies like Aviva that does industrial decarbonization of the grid and of manufacturing industrial sites, AutoGrid, which is a VPP, EV Connect, which will help do smart charging as we invest in all these things. So I want to touch on some of the things in IRA that are going to be game-changing for us and our space specifically. And I'll just share, they included several tax credits that allow consumers to take greater control of their energy usage. So 30% tax credits for load center upgrades that will make the homes safer. EV charger installations, standalone energy storage systems, solar panels, inverters, and these are 25C, 30C, 48C, for those that are nerdy enough to remember the numbers of the tax credit, that's including me. The IRA also includes home electrification rebates, and for homeowners in low and moderate income areas, this is something we really were passionate about. So it's because we need to make the homes, the small businesses, they need to be producing energy with solar, and as well as consuming it, and eventually have that communication to the grid and that connection to the grid, so that they can both reinforce in time of outage or peak load or swings from climate, and also reduce demand from the grid or pulling from the grid. It is the future, and we think that IRA is really going to enable us to accelerate that journey. We saw with COVID, and I'll let you get your question, but we saw with COVID that what we thought was going to happen with digitization, in 10, 15 years from now, happened in like 3 years. I mean, it accelerated things significantly on that front, and it's continuing to happen. And this legislation is going to accelerate a lot of transformation that we thought was going to take a lot longer. So the biggest question in my mind is, are we going to be truly ready for all that it's going to bring and mean, and can we make the most of it?
All right, well, it's actually a perfect segue, because Andrew, I wanted to talk to you about Invenergy's interests in the transmission sector, because when we talk about the challenges of achieving the goals of these various laws, transmission is one of the biggest ones. We'll talk, and we're going to have another question that talks about this more broadly, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about Invenergy's interest in as an independent transmission owner, and again, sort of setting the stage by talking about the role of transmission and sort of not only enabling the clean energy transition, which is, I think, crucial, but also enabling greater reliability and resilience, more generally in the grid.
Thank you. This question gets me fired up, so thank you for asking. It sounds familiar. Andrew Wills, I'm with Invenergy. For those of you who don't know who Invenergy is, we're the world's largest private clean energy company. We develop, own, and operate assets all over the world. We've developed 200 plus projects, and that's more than 30 gigawatts of clean power that we're putting onto systems all over the world. That's solar, wind, storage, gas, offshore wind, transmission, really anything in the energy space you can think of, we're probably doing it somewhere. It's a really exciting time to be in this industry. I've spent the last 11, 12 years in the electric sector, and I've never seen anything like what is happening today. I don't think any of us have, and probably ever will again. It's just such an incredible industry to be a part of right now. Let's talk transmission, though. Invenergy, that is our biggest priority and our biggest business right now, and I think it is really out of necessity. I just came from the Department of Energy, where I was Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor for the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, where we look at things like grid security, grid reliability, and grid resilience. Well, one thing that will give us all three of those things is transmission. One thing we can't build a grid going forward without, and that is transmission. Invenergy is really looking to build a backbone, an HVDC backbone of clean, the ability to bring clean power onto the system. And one thing I want to clarify and kind of touch on is we're having a lot of conversations, political conversations about transmission, which I never thought we would do, but we are. We're on the Hill talking about it all the time, and I think for the Hill, it is something they're thinking about all the time. Somewhere along the way, transmission got branded as like a clean energy thing, and I don't know where, but I remember when I was a baby lawyer for NERC, the engineers who pulled me aside, and I'm not an engineer, by the way, engineers who pulled me aside, they would always tell me that you can't color code electrons. In other words, you can't tell which electrons to hop onto the system and which can't. Transmission is infrastructure. It is the ability to get from point A to point B with your electricity, and that's the way we really see it. Our big project we're working very closely on right now is the Grain Belt Express project, and that project would take power from Dodge City, Kansas, and eventually all the way into the PJM market. It crosses 3 markets. It is a quintessential interregional transmission project. Not only does it allow the ability for states like Kansas that are on one end of the line to build great clean power and great new energy projects for the state of Kansas, but it also provides that reliability benefit being a bidirectional transmission line, meaning that if you have an energy emergency on this side of the country, the other side of the country can help. I think that's a message and a line of thinking that gets lost here. We're also working on something right now called intertie optimization, and it's this concept that with software and with technology, we can make sure that where these grids are being connected, it's being done in the most efficient way. That is kind of how we're going to move forward and how we're going to continue to bring these new assets onto the system we're building through the IRA. I also wanted to mention one thing before we go. It's important to recognize what a historic investment in transmission that some of these recent bills that passed were, like the bipartisan infrastructure bill. You have the transmission facilitation program, which allows the federal government to be an anchor tenant for transmission. In other words, allows them to provide that certainty for transmission developers to build those lines. That is a great program, and I do not want to diminish things like TFP and the other things being done by DOE and the administration. But it's still important to remember there's no clear path for interregional projects to be built right now. There is no clear regulatory path to do so. There's no planning that really has provided that path. There's nothing that exists right now to do that. Without doing that, you're basically, as a developer, a transmission developer, putting your hat out and saying, hey, can you invest in this line that may be built in 15 years, that may have this much power on one end? And by the way, I need you to do it for 25-year commitment. That is a really hard question to ask as a merchant developer. So without better regulatory processes, it's just going to be hard for our country to move forward. I'm off my soapbox. Sorry, Tom.
Can I pick up one thing that Andrew said? Because I thought it was super interesting. And, you talked about the engineers at NERC telling you that they can't be color-coded. When I was lobbying in the great state of Maryland, and Malcolm just left, we would talk about how electrons also don't have state flags attached to them, right? They're not like Missouri electrons or Vermont electrons or Maryland or Delaware electrons. But your point about sort of the how do you say that word?
Politicalization.
Thank you. Of transmission assets or of hydrogen or of infrastructure is an important one. And that's why I think I'm really happy that we're able to have these kind of conversations sort of across party lines, because it is infrastructure, right? It's about job development, it's about economic development, it's about tax revenue, it's about clean, secure, and reliable energy. And so thinking about it in that way and kind of pushing back against the
politicalization.
Thank you. That's not happening for me today. Is important, right? So I appreciate the kind of venue to talk about it this way.
Awesome. All right, time check, program check. We're going to take maybe 5-8 minutes at the most to talk about problems and solutions, right? We've been talking about opportunities. We're going to talk about problems and solutions, and then we're going to turn to you. So I'm looking at my iPhone. At 4:05, when we have 10 minutes left, we're going to turn to you, so be thinking about your questions, okay? Because otherwise you got to listen to us rattle on for another 10 minutes after that. So, all right, so big picture question. We've talked again about opportunities for our companies, for the technologies that we're focused on. What are the biggest challenges that we're facing? What are the things that could sort of keep these investments from achieving their goals and fruition? Fruition is the word that comes to mind. So you want to start?
I will kick us off, because I'm very eager to jump on something you both connected to, which is when a program is a sort of a bottom up, so you've got demand, people that are taking advantage of these tax credits are going to sort of dictate how the money is flowing. Additionally, if you look at the infrastructure investments, there are some similarities there with the grid modernization effort. A lot of the programs are grants that are, you get an application for a grant, but it's not a top-down strategy, and it's not a regulatory strategy, and it's not a strategy of where and how quickly and what needs to go first in order to meet our climate targets or to ensure the grid isn't overloaded, right? So it is an amazing set of accelerants, but it's not a strategic plan. And I would say the one thing that sort of that I think that I worry about is that we all know this is the moment, and we all know that we've never had a moment like this, and it's just a whole lot of money and a whole lot of programs, and it's very easy to just get going in all different directions and nobody thinking about how to really make the most of the moment. So I would say my concern is, are we going to make the most of the moment in a strategic way that's really the optimal way to invest a lot of these funds to prepare for where we're going?
So we've got a bunch of chess pieces, but we don't really know we haven't really figured out how to play the game yet, so. All right, who's next?
I don't know that I would totally agree with that.
Okay.
I think that there is a fair amount of thought in terms of where the chess pieces are going, right? I think that some of the more recent legislation has embedded public policy objectives into traditional tax policy, for example, and so things like domestic content, things like energy communities that are targeting fossil communities, those sorts of things are ways in which there is some strategy being played out. We're thinking about the development of the supply chain and sort of the sequencing of supply chain, right? If we have all upstream and no downstream, that's not going to work. We have all downstream and no upstream, that's not going to work either. And I think that SEMA was drafted in that way. I think on the transmission side, you identified building blocks. Doesn't mean I think it is going to be perfect by any means, but I do think there has been, in a way that we have not seen in legislation, or I certainly have not seen, kind of this inherent additional policy considerations that were not necessarily there before.
Thank you, Abby. Dan, Andrew, you guys want to tell us what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I'll do two things. One, I think, is that for our company, right, I think that they're most immediate.
A little bit closer again.
There we are. These are, I'm used to the ones here, okay. That the most immediate concern, right, is getting the IRS interpretations right on the implementation of the IRA rules, right? There's enough uncertainty still standing out there, whether it be on the hydrogen credits, nuclear credits, kind of go down the line, that we need to have clarity on that, because like our investment of $900 million into hydrogen, that is pending final determination, and that's really important. It's also important when we think about looking out into the future and making sure we have multiple uses or avenues for long-term investments and commitments. When we look at the nuclear fleet, not just us, but the industry, right? We have 60-year license lives on most of these assets. We're highly confident we can go to at least 80 years. That's 450 million labor hours associated with adding those 20 extra years to those assets and the reliability to the system. It's a big deal. So having the confidence that we have support on an ongoing basis, so we're not scrambling to survive for these plants in the long term, becomes really critical. I think the other point when you're talking about transmission and investment and reliability, we all want to advance to a clean energy outcome that addresses climate in a significant way. Reliability, dispatchability becomes really important in that conversation. We, for the first time, were able to offer a 24/7 time-matched clean energy product to Microsoft and one to ComEd, where we could say every hour of your consumption, you know you're using clean energy for the first time. As we think about moving forward with all these other clean energy priorities, we need to have a combination that meets that critical need of using energy, clean energy, every hour of consumption. And that's going to be a challenge that is infrastructure, it is storage, it is solar, it's a lot of things. But I think when you think about what is the long-term strategy, if we're not getting to the idea of getting clean energy every hour that people use it, we're not going to get to the end game.
Awesome. All right, we got 2 minutes. Andrew, I'm going to turn to you. And then when I raise my hand, we're done, because I'm committed to these folks that we would give them time for questions. So.
Got it. So maybe this is part of the problem, being a pessimist. I started with my problems, so I'm sorry. Rather than talking about, Invenergy's fabulous Clean Path project that we're building in New York, a transmission line that connects the northern part of the state to New York City, or rather than talking about our fabulous New Mexico project, transmission project that takes power across the state, I started with the problem, so I'm sorry for that. But I'm gonna keep going on this, because there really is a challenge with transmission, long distance transmission, getting power from point A to point B, and actually paying for those. How are we going to address that challenge? I think you said it best when you said we all want the benefits of clean energy. We all want clean power, right? One way or another, we all want it. We all want to receive the benefits that IRA promised from a climate perspective. But we at Invenergy, and my boss, Kelly Speaks-Bachman, recently wrote an op-ed in Utility Dive, and she made the point that 80% of the climate benefits from IRA will not be realized without a huge expansion of our transmission system. That is a really shocking figure whenever we're looking at projects that are taking 10, 20, 30 years to get built because we have no clear path. In terms of solutions, I do want to say there are some solutions and things that are actually happening. Like I said, we're actually talking about this on the Hill now, which is really crazy. There's this bill, Big Wires bill, which is a Big Wires Act, Senator Hickenlooper and Representative Peters introduced recently. There are some real significant changes that bill and things like it could do. Things like minimum transfer requirements in between regions. Those are really good solutions. FERC could take some of these actions. FERC has existing authority under the Federal Power Act to do many of these things. Now, whether Congress passing a NERC study in last year's funding bill was the right thing, I don't know.
No.
Will it delay? Will it delay my former colleague Willie Phillips over at FERC? I hope not. He said on the record not. But there are some real challenges with moving transmission forward, and that keeps me up at night.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for sticking to the time. All right, showtime. We got a gentleman with a mic. We've got, raise your hand if you got some questions for us. There's one right there. Anyone else? Who's next after this gentleman? All right.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Hello. Well, my name is Kuda Verdi. I'm originally from Azerbaijan, but moved to the United States like 3 years ago. I have a question to Madame Abigail. Madame Abigail, as a president and CEO of Solar Industries Associations, what's your expectations the next decades of solar industry in the United States, and what can we expect from the US government in the next decades? I beg your pardon, and I also want to see myself in the renewable energy sector. So that's why it's very intelligent for me, and I want to know the most specific projects and the demandings from United States, and I want a response from your side especially. Well, thanks indeed.
Sure. Thank you. So what do I think about the view of the industry, solar, and I'm not storage in there, solar and storage industry in the next decade? What are we in, 2023?
Mm-hmm.
So I think by the end of, so now solar and storage alone is about 5% of US energy generation. I think in the next 7 years, it'll be about 30%. By 2035, it'll be 35 or 40%. That's consistent with our climate goals, consistent with the president's plan, consistent with the technology we have now. That obviously will require a number of things, including transmission, to happen, to make that happen. But I think I also heard you sort of, but that's not all, right? The industry is more than just solar panels and projects. It's the humans that are employed in our industry. And I think by the end of this decade, we'll be close to 1 million people employed in the solar industry. We have about 260,000 now. And so as you think about what that growth looks like, what those opportunities look like, it is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that our doors are wide open. Not only wide open, but that we are walking through them and bringing people with us, right? It's not enough to just say, hey, we're open for business, but to really actually recruit and seek out a really diverse candidate pool for our industry. So what do I think the US government will do? Well, I think elections matter, I'll just say that. But I think the clean energy sector writ large has shown that it is a job producer and a capital deployment magic sauce, right? If we allow the markets to work. And so I think a smart policy moving forward would be to figure out ways to continue to enhance competition and create opportunities for these companies and the people who work in these companies to really foster.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. Question right here, Katie Cullen.
Hi there. Really, really good panel. And I know many of you up there, so it's just really fun. So first, I just want to say, on the transmission piece, you're absolutely right. I mean, you got to have a way to pay for interregional lines. You can't mandate an interregional transmission line and not have the benefit spread and the pay spread. And getting that done is just going to be so hard, but hopefully we will. But my question is really to Dan. It's on hydrogen. On what you said, you were talking about that Constellation is now producing more gray hydrogen than, frankly, you can even use.
The U.S. is.
That
was
right.
All the refineries, all the ammonia. That's just what the market is today in the United States.
And that it would take every renewable to actually turn that hydrogen into green. So DOE, is there a disconnect? Because DOE has just put an RFI out on demand saying that we really actually have to somehow figure out demand for hydrogen, but it sounds like there's already enough demand for hydrogen in the country. And I was kind of wondering why their RFI on demand when frankly it seems like there's a lot of demand.
What a great question, Katie. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's two parts to it. It is a great question. There's what is the future state, right? And there is a goal of an extra 10 million tons by the end of this decade, right? That has been the push that is out there. I will say that, given our footprint of our assets, where they're located, the fact that nuclear power provides 24/7 clean energy that you can count on every hour for hydrogen production, which is pretty critical for that process. We've had well over 100 people talk to us about a range of projects. And that's from the largest of companies to new upstarts looking at new technologies, a range of SAF all the way down the line of opportunities, right? And so trying to assess how quickly that comes, how ready their technology is, and honestly, in many cases, how good their funding is to be able to move forward becomes pretty important. When you think about the gray hydrogen market, it's what exists today, right? To convert that into clean, somebody would have to be motivated or incentivized to move off gray to something else. That doesn't necessarily exist, but I think a little bit of my goal was that if you think about how big that market is, and we think about we want to go to this big number, then we go to a bigger number 10 years down the road from that, and then down the road, the amount of electricity required to meet that goal is really significant, right? And I could equally use 75 of the 96 nuclear power reactors in the United States. If they solely made power for hydrogen production, that would meet what we consume today. And I think it's just, we all lay out lots of great goals of what we want to accomplish, 35% market share for solar, go down the line, all those things. They're enormous investments, and when you think about reliability and being there as on-demand resources, not as intermittent resources, that becomes the complexity of the challenge, because it's easy to put those goals out there. The delivery on them is a big ask, and it's going to require what everybody's talking about, but it's a lot to get there.
It don't make sense because you're really talking about demand for green as opposed to demand for gray.
It's just a quantum of what we have today, but the goal, right, at the end of the decade is to be the green to be as big as the gray is. So how big is that? Because you say 10 million doesn't sound as big as all the renewables.
This is one of the reasons why Jigar Shah is pushing the rapid deployment of virtual power plants so robustly, because it is going to put a big strain on electricity.
And not just at the transmission level either, but at the distribution level as well. So, yeah. All right. Let's see if we have time for one more quick question and answer. Otherwise, I'm going to go to the panel and say last word, 30 seconds each.
We have,
question.
Sorry, one question from our virtual audience. And Dan, you alluded to this a little bit. It's about the upcoming IRS guidance for the 45V tax credit. There's been much debate about how stringent it should be, particularly time matching. Europe is adopting a gradual approach. What do you think that should look like here in the U.S.?
I think we were happy to see, kind of Europe recognize the fact that using existing resources on the nuclear front and working their way into it. We think that makes sense if you're going to move forward on advancing a clean hydrogen product in the United States as we're seeing in Europe. So I think we were very encouraged that that was the step that they made. We do believe in time matching. We do believe in geographic matching. We've always struggled, and why we offer this 24/7 product is we've struggled with the idea of saying a REC made in April in Texas is equivalent to energy consumption in Virginia in August and calling that clean. We've struggled with that, right? So we think both of those things make sense. We think taking advantage of the resource here to accelerate the transition also makes sense. So the additionality concept, I think, is something that we've thought was probably not the right place to start if we're going to meet this demand.
All right, we're going to finish right on time. I see Chrissy walking up with the hook. So please join me in, first of all, thanking Heather and a wonderful, wonderful team for this event. And join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions.
And we have a 10-minute break. So please grab some coffee, have some conversations, and we'll see you back at 4:25.